We had just returned from our honeymoon when my husband took me to a Michelin star steakhouse to celebrate our new life together. As he stepped away to take a business call, an elderly man bumped into my chair, slipped a crumpled $100 bill and a torn napkin into my hand, and whispered, "Run, while you still can." I thought he was out of his mind, but then I looked down at my champagne glass, and my blood ran ice cold. I realized I had exactly 3 minutes to escape before my charming, handsome new husband murdered me. My name is Simone, and I am 35 years old. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to trust your absolute deepest instincts to survive a nightmare disguised as a fairy tale. The crystal chandeliers above our private booth cast a warm golden glow over the white tablecloth. The restaurant was filled with the low, elegant hum of clinking silver and soft jazz. Julian had just ordered his third oyster appetizer when his phone buzzed softly against the mahogany table. He glanced at the screen, and a subtle tightness flashed across his jaw. He smoothed the lapels of his custom-tailored suit and offered me that signature devastatingly perfect smile that had completely swept me off my feet over the past year. "Duty calls, my love," he murmured, his deep voice thick with manufactured regret. "It is the development firm. Kendrick is panicking about the zoning permits for the new high-rise. Give me exactly 2 minutes to talk him off a ledge, and then the rest of this beautiful evening is entirely yours." He leaned across the table, pressing a soft kiss to my forehead before sliding out of the circular leather booth. I watched him weave through the crowded dining room, his tall, athletic frame commanding attention from everyone he passed. I took a slow breath, letting the tension drop from my shoulders. I reached for my water glass, planning to take a quiet sip, when a sharp jolt hit the back of my chair. I spilled water down my wrist and turned around, ready to accept an apology from a careless waiter. Instead, I found myself staring up into the weathered, desperate face of an elderly African-American man. He wore a faded wool coat that smelled faintly of stale coffee and old paper. His eyes, though framed by deep wrinkles, were intensely sharp and wide with a terrifying urgency. Before I could speak, before I could even ask if he was all right, his rough, trembling hand shot out. He grabbed my left hand, his fingers pressing painfully hard against my wedding ring. With a swift, practiced motion, he shoved a tight, crumpled ball of paper into my palm. "Run!" He rasped, his voice barely a whisper, but heavy with pure terror. "Run while you still can. Do not drink anything. Do not go home with him." He released my hand instantly and turned away, shuffling quickly toward the kitchen service doors before I could even process the bizarre encounter. My heart hammered against my ribs. I sat frozen, my fingers tightly clenched around the small wad of paper. I glanced around the restaurant, but no one had noticed. The wealthy patrons at the surrounding tables were completely engrossed in their Wagyu steaks and vintage wines. Slowly, carefully, I unrolled the crumpled ball under the table. It was a thick, white cloth napkin. Tucked inside was a crisp, folded $100 bill. Written across the center of the napkin in black ink in hurried, jagged handwriting were 3 terrifying sentences. "He poisoned her. Locker 402. Comb 814. My stomach plummeted. He poisoned her. My mind instantly raced back to the very first night Julian and I had met. He had been so vulnerable, so open about his past. He had told me about Maya, his first fiancée. He had cried holding my hands, telling me how she had died of a sudden tragic heart attack just weeks before their wedding 3 years ago. He told me it broke him that he never thought he would find love again until I walked into his life. Suddenly, a shadow fell over the table. "Sorry about that, beautiful," Julian said smoothly, sliding back into the booth. "Kendrick is a mess without me, but I handled it." I quickly shoved the napkin and the $100 bill deep into the pocket of my silk dress. I forced my face to remain completely neutral. Over the last decade, I have built a highly successful forensic accounting firm entirely from the ground up. I am a self-made woman who makes a living hunting down hidden offshore accounts, decoding fraudulent tax returns, and catching pathological liars in the act of embezzling millions. My entire career is based on noticing the tiny, imperceptible details that other people gloss over. Discrepancies are my specialty. And suddenly, sitting across from the man I had married just 2 weeks ago, every single alarm bell in my brain began to scream. I looked at Julian, really looked at him. The restaurant was perfectly air-conditioned, yet a single tiny bead of sweat was tracing its way down his left temple. His eyes, usually warm and inviting, were locked onto the center of the table with a strange, predatory intensity. His left thumb was rhythmically tapping against his thigh beneath the table. It was a nervous tell. I had seen him do it exactly twice before. Once when a contractor asked him for a massive deposit, and once when I had playfully asked to see the deed to his supposedly fully paid-off mansion. "Let us stop talking about business," Julian said, his voice dropping an octave as he reached across the table to wrap his hand around my crystal champagne flute. He slid the glass directly in front of me. "We have a lifetime of happiness to celebrate. Drink up, my love. To our forever." I looked down at the champagne. My analytical mind, trained to spot the smallest irregularities, immediately went to work. I had been drinking from this exact bottle of Dom Perignon for the last 20 minutes. I knew exactly how the bubbles were supposed to look, but the champagne currently sitting in my glass was reacting strangely. The bubbles were not rising in a steady, elegant stream from the bottom of the flute. Instead, they were violently fizzing near the surface, clinging to the sides of the crystal in a thick, unnatural foam. I leaned forward slightly, pretending to admire the glass. The light from the chandelier hit the liquid. At the very bottom of the flute, settling beneath the pale gold liquid, was a faint, cloudy white residue. It was a powder that had not fully dissolved. My blood turned to ice. He poisoned her. Julian had not gone to take a phone call. He had gone to find a moment of privacy to crush something into my drink. He had timed it perfectly, knowing the waiter was busy, and I was distracted by his charming exit. He was sitting across from me right now, smiling his gorgeous, devastating smile, waiting for me to consume a lethal dose of whatever was sitting at the bottom of that glass. "Come on, Simone." Julian coaxed, his tone shifting from romantic to slightly impatient. His eyes narrowed just a fraction of an inch. "Drink. It is bad luck to leave a toast waiting." I looked into the eyes of the man I loved, the man I had trusted with my life and my considerable financial portfolio, and I realized with absolute clarity that I was looking at a predator. I was not a wife to him. I was an asset, and my liquidation date had just arrived. I needed to get out of this restaurant, and I needed to do it right now. But I knew if I panicked, if I screamed or made a scene, he would find a way to control the narrative. He would play the concerned husband. He would take me to a hospital of his choosing. I had to outsmart him, and I only had seconds to make my move. I took a deep breath, forcing my hand to tremble just enough to look natural. I reached for the champagne flute, but instead of wrapping my fingers around the crystal stem, I let my hand slip. My knuckles struck the heavy base of the glass. It tipped over instantly. The pale gold liquid, laced with whatever poison he had intended for me, cascaded across the white tablecloth and splashed directly onto the lap of my cream silk dress. "Oh my God," I gasped, jumping up from the leather booth. The cold champagne soaked through the delicate fabric clinging to my skin. Julian leaped to his feet. His hands hovered over me, his face twisting into a mask of perfect husbandly concern. But his eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, darted to the empty, spilled glass on the table. A flash of pure frustration crossed his face there, and gone in a fraction of a second. He grabbed a cloth napkin and reached out to dab at my dress. "I am so clumsy," I stammered, stepping back just out of his reach. "I cannot believe I just ruined this dress. I need to get to the restroom right now to run cold water over this before it stains permanently." "Let me come with you," he insisted, taking a step toward me. "I will get the maitre d' to bring some club soda." "No," I said quickly, forcing a laugh that sounded high and breathless. Please, Julian. I am embarrassed enough. Just order us another round. I will be back in 5 minutes. He hesitated. I could see the gears turning in his head. But making a scene in the middle of a Michelin-star restaurant was not part of his plan. He needed this to look like a tragic, sudden illness, not a domestic dispute. He slowly lowered his hands and offered a tight, reassuring smile. 5 minutes, beautiful, he said smoothly. Do not keep me waiting. I turned and walked away. I forced myself to keep a steady, embarrassed pace. I kept my head down, avoiding the eyes of the other diners. The restroom was located down a long, dimly lit hallway near the back of the restaurant. But right before the restroom entrance were the heavy stainless steel swinging doors leading into the kitchen. I did not even break stride. I pushed through the metal doors. The contrast was jarring. The quiet elegance of the dining room was instantly replaced by the chaotic shouting energy of a high-end commercial kitchen. The air was thick with the smell of searing meat, garlic, and hot oil. Waiters rushed past me with heavy trays. A sous chef yelled an order across the line. A few line cooks stared at me, a woman in a ruined designer dress marching through their workspace, but nobody stopped me. I moved with absolute terrifying purpose. I spotted the heavy red exit sign glowing over a metal door at the far end of the kitchen. I shoved it open and burst out into the cool, damp night air. I was in a narrow back alley behind the restaurant. The smell of dumpsters and wet asphalt hit me. My chest heaved as I looked frantically left and right. At the end of the alley, a young man was sitting on the hood of a beaten-up Honda Civic smoking a cigarette next to a stack of food delivery bags. I ran up to him. He jumped off the hood, his eyes going wide as he took in my appearance. "Hey, lady. You cannot be back here," he started to say. I reached into the pocket of my ruined silk dress and pulled out the crumpled $100 bill Silas had given me. I shoved it directly against the driver's chest. "Take this," I told him, my voice completely devoid of panic. "I need you to get in your car right now and drive me as far away from this alley as possible." No questions asked. The kid looked at the crisp $100 bill, then at me. He tossed his cigarette onto the ground, crushed it with his sneaker, and unlocked the doors. "Get in!" I dove into the passenger seat. Before I even had the seatbelt buckled, the Honda shot out of the alley and merged recklessly into the busy Atlanta traffic. I slouched down in the seat, keeping my head below the window line. The neon lights of the city blurred past the windshield. My heart was beating so hard I could hear it echoing in my ears. I had actually done it. I was out. Then my purse vibrated. I unzipped my clutch and pulled out my phone. The screen was lit up with Julian's name and a picture of us smiling on our wedding day. The sight of his face made my stomach churn. I ignored the call. 5 seconds later, a text message popped up. "Where are you?" I checked the restroom. The hostess said she did not see you leave. I did not reply. Another text arrived immediately. "Simone, you are scaring me. Please answer the phone." My thumb hovered over the power button. I was about to turn the phone off entirely when a small green icon caught my eye in the top corner of the screen. It was the location sharing icon. A cold sweat broke out across my neck. 2 months before the wedding, there had been a string of break-ins in my neighborhood. Julian had been so worried. He had insisted we install a premium family safety app on both of our phones so he could always make sure I got to my car safely after working late at the accounting firm. I had thought it was sweet. I had thought it was protective. It was not a safety measure. It was a digital leash. He was tracking me right now. He knew exactly what road I was on and how fast I was moving. He would know exactly where this car stopped. "Pull over," I commanded the driver. "What?" "We are in the middle of a busy intersection," he protested, glancing nervously in the rearview mirror. I said, "Pull over right now." The driver slammed on the brakes, jerking the car toward the right lane and coming to a stop at a red light. Right next to us, idling heavily in the curb lane, was a massive city garbage truck. The workers were hanging off the back, tossing black trash bags into the churning compactor. I rolled down the passenger window. I looked at the sleek, expensive smartphone in my hand. It contained my contacts, my photos, my entire digital life. But right now, it was a homing beacon for a man who wanted me dead. Without a second thought, I chucked the phone out the window. It soared through the air and landed squarely in the back of the garbage truck just as the light turned green. The truck roared to life, carrying my digital footprint away to the municipal dump. "Drive," I told the kid, rolling the window back up. "Take me to the nearest gas station, a cheap one, and then find a motel that does not ask for ID." 10 minutes later, he pulled into a brightly lit, rundown gas station on the outskirts of the city. I thanked him and stepped out into the night. My silk dress was sticky and cold, and I was shivering, but my mind was completely clear. I walked into the convenience store past the rows of junk food and cheap sunglasses and walked straight up to the cashier. "I need a prepaid burner phone," I said, pulling my emergency credit card from my wallet. "And a charger." The cashier, a bored-looking woman snapping her chewing gum, tossed a cheap plastic phone package onto the counter. I swiped my card, tore the package open, and powered the device on while standing right there in the aisle. I was an auditor. I spent my days following the money, finding the lies hidden in the ledgers. Julian thought I was a fragile, naive woman he could manipulate and discard. He thought he could drain my life and my bank accounts without leaving a trace. But he had made one fatal miscalculation. He had married a woman who knew exactly how to dismantle a fraud. I walked out of the gas station and headed toward the flickering neon sign of the motel next door. I had a burner phone. I had the clothes on my back, and I had the locker combination the old man gave me. It was time to find out exactly who I had married and exactly how much he had already stolen from me. The heavy wooden door of room 12 clicked shut behind me, and I immediately threw the deadbolt. I slid the metal chain into place and dragged a heavy scuffed wooden chair from the corner, wedging it firmly under the doorknob. The motel room smelled of cheap bleach and years of stale cigarette smoke. The floral bedspread was faded, and the single lamp on the nightstand cast a harsh yellow light across the peeling wallpaper. It was a world away from the crystal chandeliers and imported champagne of the restaurant, but in that moment it was the safest place on earth. I peeled off my ruined silk dress, shivering as the damp fabric clung to my skin, and tossed it onto the floor. I pulled on the complimentary thin white bathrobe hanging in the bathroom and sat down on the edge of the sagging mattress. My hands were finally starting to shake as the sheer adrenaline of the escape began to wear off. But I could not afford to fall apart. Not yet. I tore open the plastic packaging of the prepaid burner phone. I powered it on, connected to the motel's unsecured Wi-Fi, and immediately downloaded a virtual private network app to mask my location. I am a forensic accountant. I spend my life tracking digital footprints for a living, and I knew exactly how easily a sloppy internet connection could be traced. Once my IP address was safely rerouted through a server in Europe, I opened the web browser and navigated to the secure login portal of my primary financial institution. Julian thought I was just a wealthy, successful woman he could dazzle with romance and luxury. He knew I owned my own firm and managed millions in corporate audits, but he completely underestimated the paranoid, meticulous nature of my profession. He assumed my money was sitting in standard accounts, waiting to be claimed by her grieving widower. He did not know that I compartmentalized my wealth with the same ruthless efficiency I applied to my clients. I bypassed the standard two-factor authentication by accessing an encrypted cloud vault I kept specifically for emergencies. The banking dashboard loaded on the small screen. First, I checked the joint checking account Julian and I had opened shortly after our engagement. It was supposed to be our household fund. The balance sat exactly where I had left it, an innocuous $20,000. That was the decoy. It was meant to look perfectly normal. Next, I tapped into my personal high-yield savings account. This was the vault. This was the money I had sacrificed my 20s for, grinding through 80-hour work weeks building my firm from a tiny leased desk to a corner office suite. This was the safety net I had sworn no man would ever touch. The screen refreshed. The bold black numbers appeared on the bright white background. My breath caught in my throat. The balance was wrong. Exactly $50,000 was missing. I blinked hard thinking it was a glitch with the mobile browser, but the numbers remained unchanged. I felt a cold, sickening drop in the pit of my stomach. I quickly tapped into the pending transactions tab. There it was. An outgoing wire transfer for $50,000 flat. The timestamp showed the transaction had been initiated exactly 2 hours ago. 2 hours ago, Julian and I were sitting in the steakhouse. 2 hours ago, he had kissed my forehead, told me he loved me, and stepped away from the table to take a business call to talk his brother Kendrick off a ledge regarding a zoning permit. He was not talking to his brother about zoning permits. He was authorizing a wire transfer from my personal account. The initial shock rapidly morphed into a hot, blinding wave of pure rage. The tears I thought I was going to cry completely evaporated. I was no longer a terrified bride running from a murderer. I was an auditor staring at an active crime scene, and the thief had just left his fingerprints everywhere. I clicked on the expanded details of the pending wire transfer. Most people look at a bank statement and only see the names and the amounts. I look at the routing transit numbers, the SWIFT codes, and the intermediary clearinghouses. The money was not being sent to a local domestic bank. It was being routed through a regional financial hub in Delaware, destined for an entity listed as Apex Holdings, LLC. I recognized the corporate structure immediately. Apex Holdings was not a real company. It was a ghost corporation, a shell entity designed to receive funds and immediately bounce them to an offshore tax haven, completely washing the money of its original source. It was a classic textbook asset extraction technique. But Julian had made a critical error. He was not a forensic accountant. I opened a new tab and accessed the public business registry database I use daily for my corporate audits. I typed in Apex Holdings LLC and pulled up their articles of incorporation. The registered agent for the LLC was a boutique law firm located right here in Atlanta. It was the exact same law firm his brother Kendrick used to manage his supposedly massive real estate empire. The entire picture snapped into focus with terrifying clarity. The $50,000 was just under the specific threshold that would trigger an automatic mandatory phone verification from my bank's fraud department. Julian knew my banking limits. He had transferred the maximum amount he could siphon quietly. This was a bridge loan to keep his brother's fraudulent real estate development afloat. If I had stayed at that restaurant, if I had drunk that tainted champagne, my heart would have stopped before midnight. Julian would have played the devastated, weeping husband. By tomorrow morning, the $50,000 wire would have cleared, quietly swallowed by the shell company. Then, as my legal next of kin, Julian would have inherited everything else. My townhouse, my investment portfolios, my business assets. He would have liquidated my entire life to fund his family's fake generational wealth. He had not married me out of love. He had married me for a hostile takeover. I sat alone in the dim motel room, staring at the glowing screen of the burner phone. The sheer audacity of his plan was staggering. He had underestimated my intelligence, my resilience, and my absolute refusal to be a victim. I reached into the pocket of my bathrobe and pulled out the crumpled white napkin the old man had given me. I smoothed it out on the mattress next to the phone. The black ink stared back at me. He poisoned her. Locker 402, comb 814. Silas knew the truth about Maya, Julian's first fiancée. She had not died of a sudden tragic heart attack. She had been liquidated just like I was supposed to be tonight. I looked at the digital clock on the motel nightstand. It was flashing 2 in the morning. I could not stay in hiding. If I disappeared, if I ran away and started a new life under a different name, Julian would win. He would file a missing persons report, wait the legal requirement, and eventually claim my estate anyway. He would get away with murder, and he would use my hard-earned money to do it. I refused to let that happen. I had built my empire with my own 2 hands, and I was not about to let a charming parasite and his arrogant family strip it away from me. I was going to go to that bus station. I was going to open that locker and read whatever files Silas had left for me. And then I was going to systematically dismantle Julian's entire life. I turned off the burner phone and lay back against the flat motel pillows. I closed my eyes, but I did not sleep. I spent the rest of the night calculating my next move. Tomorrow morning, I would not be the terrified woman running through an alleyway. I would be the wife returning home ready to play the game until I had everything I needed to destroy them all. The morning sun felt harsh and unforgiving as I stepped out of the dingy motel room. I had barely slept, my mind running through every possible financial permutation and legal loophole. I walked to a cheap thrift store a few blocks down the road and bought a pair of dark jeans and an oversized black hoodie to cover my stained silk dress. I paid in cash, using the change from the $100 bill Silas had given me. I could not risk using a credit card or hailing a rideshare service. Julian would be monitoring my digital footprint like a hawk. Instead, I took 3 different city buses to get back to my neighborhood, meticulously checking over my shoulder at every stop. I needed to get back to my townhouse. I bought the property 3 years ago entirely under my own name, long before I ever met Julian. It was my sanctuary. Inside my home office sat my secure work laptop, fortified with military-grade encryption and direct access to my accounting firm's master servers. Without it, I could not trace the rest of the offshore accounts or secure my clients' assets. I also needed my passport and the emergency cash stash I kept hidden inside a hollowed-out encyclopedia on my bookshelf. I planned to get in, pack a discreet duffel bag, and get out in under 5 minutes. As I walked up the manicured sidewalk toward my front porch, every muscle in my body suddenly tensed. Parked directly across the street, half hidden under the shade of a large oak tree, was a sleek matte black Range Rover. It was Kendrick's car. My heart hammered against my ribs. I quickly scanned the street, but it was quiet. I walked up the steps to my front door and reached into my pocket for my keys. That was when I noticed the small glowing indicator light on my digital deadbolt. It was supposed to be a solid red when armed. It was glowing a soft, inviting green. The security system had been completely disarmed. I stood frozen on the welcome mat. I had never given Julian the master passcode to the alarm precisely because we did not live here full-time. He had moved into my place temporarily after the wedding while we supposedly shopped for a larger house, but I had kept the security protocols strictly under my control. Or so I thought. I took a slow, silent breath, sliding my hand into the pocket of my hoodie to grip the heavy metal base of my keys. I pushed the front door open. The heavy scent of expensive dark roast coffee and strong vanilla perfume hit my senses immediately. I stepped into the foyer and looked toward the living room. They had made themselves completely at home. Sitting on my custom velvet sofa, drinking coffee from my personal ceramic mugs, were the 4 people who stood to gain everything from my murder. Julian was pacing near the fireplace. His older brother Kendrick was lounging in my reading chair, tapping away on his phone. Julian's mother Evelyn sat perfectly upright on the love seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap. And next to her was Chloe, Kendrick's white wife, casually flipping through an architectural magazine she had taken from my coffee table. The moment the front door clicked shut behind me, the room went dead silent. Julian spun around. His eyes widened in a display of absolute manufactured shock. He sprinted across the hardwood floor, closing the distance between us before I could even take a step back. He wrapped his arms fiercely around my shoulders and pulled me into a crushing hug. "Simone," he cried out, his voice cracking with exaggerated theatrical emotion. "Oh my God. Thank God. Thank God you are alive. I have been out of my mind with worry." My skin crawled violently. I could feel his strong hands gripping my shoulders, his fingers digging into my muscles, keeping me locked in place. He was not hugging me out of relief. He was physically restraining me, checking to see if I was going to fight back. He buried his face into my neck, breathing heavily, playing the role of the terrified, devoted husband to absolute perfection. I did not hug him back. I stood perfectly rigid, my arms resting flat against my sides, my eyes fixed over his shoulder on the rest of the family. Evelyn stood up, smoothing down her perfectly tailored tweed skirt. Her face was set in a mask of cold patrician disapproval. "Where on earth have you been, Simone?" she demanded, her tone laced with absolute disdain. "Julian was up all night calling hospitals and police stations. Do you have any idea the kind of stress you have put my son through on your honeymoon, no less?" Chloe uncrossed her legs and tossed the magazine aside. She set her ceramic mug down directly on my glass coffee table, completely ignoring the coasters sitting inches away. "We were literally about to call the psychiatric ward," Chloe added, her voice dripping with fake, condescending sympathy. "You cannot just disappear into the night like a lunatic, Simone. People talk." I gently but firmly pushed Julian back, breaking his grip on my shoulders. I stepped fully into the living room, my eyes sweeping over the space. Sitting right next to Chloe's carelessly placed mug on the coffee table was a shiny, freshly cut silver key. "How did you get in here?" I asked, keeping my voice completely level and devoid of any emotion. Julian let out a ragged sigh, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He looked at me with wide, pleading eyes. "I made a copy of the key last week, my love, for emergencies. And thank God I did. When you ran out of the restaurant last night screaming at the waiters and throwing your glass on the floor, I thought you were having a complete mental breakdown. I was terrified you had come home and hurt yourself. I had to bypass the alarm box in the garage just to get inside." I stared at him, screaming at the waiters. Throwing my glass, I had quietly spilled my drink and slipped out the back door without making a single sound. He was already rewriting history. He was laying the heavy groundwork for his backup plan. If the poison did not work, he was going to build a rock-solid narrative that I was suffering from severe psychological instability. Kendrick finally looked up from his phone. He stood up, towering over me with his broad, intimidating frame. "Look at you," Kendrick sneered, gesturing up and down at my thrift store hoodie and messy hair. "You look like a street vagrant. Julian told us you have been acting paranoid for weeks, but this is a whole new low. You need serious medical help, Simone." I realized in that exact moment that they were not just here to ambush me. They were staging an intervention. They had cornered me in my own home, completely united in their lie. If I accused Julian of poisoning me right now, I would sound exactly like the hysterical, paranoid woman they were painting me out to be. They would use my own accusations as proof of my insanity, call their private doctors, and have me institutionalized before lunch. I had to play their game, and I had to play it better. I lowered my head, forcing my shoulders to slump in a posture of complete defeat. I let out a trembling, ragged breath, burying my hands deep into the pockets of my oversized thrift store hoodie. If they wanted a broken, unstable, hysterical woman, I was going to give them an absolute masterclass in submission. I looked up through my eyelashes, my eyes wide and shimmering with manufactured, unshed tears. Julian immediately softened his stance, thinking he had successfully broken my spirit just by having his family corner me. But Evelyn was not finished. She stood up from the love seat, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She paced elegantly across the Persian rug I had imported from Turkey, looking at me as if I were a stain on her perfect shoes. "Do you have any idea how it looked, Simone?" Evelyn demanded, her voice cutting through the quiet room like a serrated blade. "Julian is a highly respected developer. Our family has spent decades cultivating a flawless reputation in the elite circles of this city. And you running out the back door of a Michelin star restaurant like a common criminal in the middle of a manic episode." We received a frantic call from the restaurant manager. Julian had to pay a substantial sum just to keep them from calling the press about a domestic altercation. I watched her lips move, marveling at the pure, unadulterated projection. She was standing in a house that I paid for, lecturing me about stability and reputation, while her own son was actively transferring my stolen funds to a ghost company. But I kept my face perfectly still, projecting nothing but confusion and shame. This is exactly what happens when a woman becomes too obsessed with her own ambition. Evelyn continued, her tone turning icy and definitive. She weaponized my career with surgical precision. "We all warned Julian. We told him that your little accounting firm was putting entirely too much stress on your fragile mind. You are so desperate to prove you do not need anyone, you have completely fractured your own reality. Independence is fine, Simone, but you have turned it into a psychosis. You think everyone is out to get you because you do not know how to exist in a loving, established family environment. Chloe shifted on the velvet couch, bringing my favorite hand-painted ceramic mug to her lips. She took a slow, loud sip of my expensive dark roast coffee. She crossed her long legs, the picture of wealthy white privilege, completely comfortable, sitting in a home she could never afford on her own, passing judgment on the black woman who owned it. Honestly, Simone, Chloe sighed, her voice dripping with fake, condescending sympathy. Julian told us about your little episodes before the wedding. We thought you were getting therapy. We really did. But this behavior... She gestured dismissively at my thrift store clothes and messy hair. This is just unhinged. I looked at her, letting the silence stretch for a fraction of a second. Julian had been laying the groundwork for my insanity before we even walked down the aisle. He had been planting seeds of doubt, telling his family I was unstable, ensuring that when the time came to eliminate me, nobody would ask any questions. It is hard enough for this family to integrate someone from your background, Chloe added, leaning forward with a sickeningly sweet smile. We have tried so hard to be welcoming, we really have, but your blue-collar roots are showing loudly today. You cannot just bring your street mentality into our world. Running away in the middle of the night, ignoring your husband, acting so ghetto and erratic over absolutely nothing. Do you know how exhausting it is for us to constantly manage you, to constantly clean up your messes so our friends at the country club do not find out? Julian married a massive liability. Kendrick scoffed loudly from the reading chair, shaking his head in disgust. She is a liability, Chloe. That is exactly the word for it. We are trying to close a multi-million-dollar real estate acquisition this week, and my little brother is up all night crying over a woman who cannot even handle a nice dinner without suffering a severe paranoid delusion. The gaslighting was so intensely synchronized, it was genuinely breathtaking. They had rehearsed this. Every word, every condescending sigh, every look of fake pity was carefully choreographed to break my grip on reality. They needed me to doubt my own sanity. They needed me to believe that my memory of the violently fizzing champagne and the missing $50,000 were just symptoms of a cracking, diseased mind. Julian stepped closer, placing a warm, heavy hand on my arm. He rubbed my sleeve gently. "We are not mad at you, baby," Julian whispered, his voice thick with a perfectly calibrated tone of empathy. "We are just scared. You have been working 80-hour weeks for years. You have been talking about hidden accounts and corporate fraud so much that you are bringing your work home. You are seeing enemies where there is only family. You need rest, Simone. You need serious medical rest." I looked down at Julian's hand resting on my arm. It was the exact same hand that had crushed poison into my drink 12 hours ago. It was the same hand that had typed in the routing numbers to steal the money I had earned through blood, sweat, and sleepless nights. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab the heavy, solid brass lamp off the side table and smash it against his perfect, lying jawline. But I am a forensic accountant. I do not act on impulse. I act on cold, hard evidence. I let a single calculated tear slip down my cheek. Julian has generously offered to handle your business affairs while you take a leave of absence, Evelyn added smoothly. She sat back down on the love seat, smoothing her tweed skirt, her tone shifting from aggressive to completely businesslike. He has already drafted an email to your firm's senior partners explaining that you are dealing with a severe family emergency and require absolute privacy. All you need to do is sign a temporary power of attorney just until you are back on your feet. There it was, the grand pivot, the transition from medical concern to total financial control. They were not even trying to be subtle about it. If the poison failed to kill me, their backup plan was to strip my agency through a forced medical proxy. They were going to drain my accounts legally with my own coerced signature while playing the role of the tragic supportive family. It is for your own good, sweetie, Chloe chimed in, offering that same saccharine smile. You are just not equipped to handle this level of pressure. You grew up fighting for scraps and now you have everything. It is classic imposter syndrome spiraling into severe paranoia. Let the men handle the heavy lifting for a while. You can go to a nice quiet retreat. Julian found a wonderful private facility in upstate New York. No cell phones, no laptops, no outside contact, just pure, uninterrupted healing. A private facility. No cell phones, no laptops. The blood roared in my ears, but my exterior remained a portrait of a broken woman. If I got into a car with them, I would never be seen again. They would lock me in a private psychiatric ward on Julian's payroll, pump me full of actual sedatives, and drain my accounts, while I lay in a chemically induced stupor. I looked around my beautifully decorated living room, at the people sitting on my expensive furniture, drinking my premium coffee, calmly plotting my total erasure from the world. I took a slow breath, letting the mask of the broken, hysterical woman drop completely. I straightened my spine, pulling my hands out of the pockets of the oversized hoodie. The sudden shift in my posture was subtle, but in a room full of predators waiting for their prey to submit, it was as loud as a gunshot. I looked directly at Julian, bypassing his fake concern entirely. "Where is my $50,000, Julian?" I asked, my voice flat, cold, and echoing with absolute authority. The room froze. Chloe stopped mid-sip. Evelyn's hand paused over her tweed skirt. Julian's perfectly constructed expression of empathy vanished, replaced by a flash of genuine, unadulterated shock. "What are you talking about?" Julian stammered, taking a small step back. "What money? Do not insult my intelligence," I snapped, stepping forward, forcing him to hold my gaze. "The $50,000 you wired out of my personal high-yield savings account, exactly 12 hours ago, while you were supposedly taking a business call. The money you routed through Apex Holdings, LLC, in Delaware. The money you stole right before you tried to poison me at that restaurant." The silence that followed was suffocating. I had just detonated a bomb in the middle of their carefully staged intervention. They had expected me to scream about the tainted champagne. They had expected me to sound crazy. They had not expected me to bring up a highly specific hidden financial transaction that only an auditor would know how to track. Kendrick recovered first. He tossed his phone onto the reading chair and crossed the room with heavy, aggressive strides. He stopped mere inches from me, using his massive frame to physically intimidate me. He looked down at me, his eyes dark and furious. "Watch your mouth, Simone." Kendrick growled, his voice a low, threatening rumble. "That was a bridge loan. We discussed it last month. You agreed to front the capital for the zoning permits. If your memory is so fractured that you cannot even remember authorizing a simple wire transfer for your own husband's business, then you are in worse shape than we thought." I laughed. It was a sharp, humorless sound that echoed off the high ceilings. "A bridge loan. That is fascinating, Kendrick. Because my bank records show the transfer was initiated from an IP address pinging directly from Julian's cell phone while I was sitting alone at the table. And as for Apex Holdings, I know it is a shell corporation managed by your boutique law firm. You are not buying zoning permits, you are hiding assets." Evelyn stood up abruptly, her composure finally cracking, her face flushed an ugly, angry red. "Enough," she snapped, her voice shrill and commanding. "We are not going to stand here and listen to these insane, paranoid delusions. Julian, she is clearly completely detached from reality. She is a danger to herself and this family's reputation. Call them in. Now." "Call who in?" I demanded, my eyes darting between Evelyn and Julian. Julian pulled his phone from his pocket, his face hardening into a cold, unrecognizable mask. The charming, loving husband was entirely gone. He tapped the screen once. "I told you, Simone. We are getting you help, whether you want it or not." I glanced toward the front window. Through the sheer curtains, I saw the doors of Kendrick's black Range Rover open. Two men stepped out onto the sidewalk. They were not wearing medical scrubs. They were wearing dark suits, their builds broad and muscular. They looked less like healthcare professionals and more like private security contractors. They began walking purposefully up my front steps. My heart slammed against my ribs. They were going to drag me out of my own house. They were going to force me into that SUV, drive me to whatever unregulated facility they had on retainer, and lock me away. Once I was inside, declared legally incapacitated by a doctor on their payroll, Chloe's threat would become reality. Julian would have full power of attorney. He would drain my firm, liquidate my properties, and erase my entire life without firing a single shot. I backed away from Kendrick, my mind racing. The front door was blocked. Julian and Evelyn were standing between me and the kitchen exit. The two men were already turning the knob on the front door, the digital lock blinking green. "You cannot do this," I said, keeping my voice steady, though my pulse was racing wildly. "This is kidnapping." "It is a medical intervention for a deeply disturbed woman," Chloe corrected smoothly, not even bothering to stand up from the couch. "It is perfectly legal when your husband authorizes it. You really should have read that prenup closer, sweetie." The front door swung open. The two men stepped into the foyer, their eyes immediately locking onto me. Julian pointed a finger at me. "Take her," Julian ordered softly. "Be gentle, but do not let her fight you. She is having an episode." The men moved forward. I did not run. I did not scream. Instead, I reached my hand behind the heavy velvet curtain draping the tall window next to the fireplace. When I had bought this townhouse, I had the security system custom designed. I knew that living alone as a successful woman required more than just a standard keypad by the front door. I had 3 silent panic buttons wired directly into the house's main electrical grid, hidden in strategic locations. My fingers found the small raised plastic button mounted to the baseboard behind the curtain. I pressed it down hard. Instantly, the house erupted. A deafening, piercing siren shrieked through the living room so loud it physically rattled the windows. It was not a standard alarm beep. It was an industrial-grade high-decibel wail designed to disorient and alert the entire neighborhood. Along with the siren, a pre-recorded voice began broadcasting from hidden speakers in the ceiling, repeating a single automated phrase. "Intruder alert. Police dispatched. Intruder alert. Police dispatched." The two men in suits stopped dead in their tracks, their hands covering their ears against the sheer volume of the siren. Kendrick stumbled back, swearing loudly, looking wildly at the ceiling. Chloe dropped her coffee mug on the glass table, the ceramic shattering her perfectly composed face, twisting into genuine panic. "Turn it off!" Julian screamed, his voice barely audible over the shrieking alarm. "Turn it off right now, Simone!" I stepped out from behind the curtain, my face entirely calm, despite the absolute chaos erupting around me. "The alarm company does not call to verify when this specific button is pushed," I yelled back, enunciating every word clearly. "The police are already on their way. They will be here in less than 2 minutes." Evelyn grabbed her designer handbag from the love seat, her eyes wide with terror. If the police arrived and found 2 hired goons trying to drag a screaming woman out of her home, there would be no sweeping it under the rug. It would be a public scandal, a criminal investigation, and the absolute destruction of the pristine social reputation she prized above all else. "We have to go," Evelyn shrieked, grabbing Julian by the arm. "Now!" Kendrick did not hesitate. He shoved past the 2 men in the foyer and bolted out the front door, sprinting toward his Range Rover. Chloe practically scrambled off the couch, ignoring the spilled coffee and broken ceramic, her high heels clicking frantically as she ran after her husband. Julian stood frozen for a split second, staring at me. The look in his eyes was pure, unadulterated hatred. The mask was entirely gone. He knew I had beaten him today. He knew I had outmaneuvered his carefully laid trap. "You are going to regret this," he mouthed, his words lost in the blaring siren. He turned and fled, following his mother and his hired men out the door. I stood alone in the center of my living room, the alarms screaming around me, watching through the window as they piled into the black SUV and sped away, their tires squealing against the asphalt. I waited exactly 60 seconds to ensure they were gone. Then I walked over to the main security panel in the hallway, punched in my master override code, and silenced the alarm. The sudden quiet was heavy and ringing. I quickly picked up my phone to call the security company and cancel the police dispatch, giving them my safe word to confirm it was a false alarm. I did not want the police here. Not yet. I did not have enough hard evidence to put Julian away forever, and I knew a premature investigation would only give his family time to destroy the paper trail. I had exactly 20 minutes before Julian realized the cops were not coming and tried to return. I ran up the stairs to my home office. I bypassed the standard password on my secure work laptop using a biometric scan and quickly backed up my entire hard drive onto a portable encrypted flash drive. I grabbed my passport from the safe, stuffed a few changes of clothes into a small duffel bag, and pulled the emergency cache from the hollowed-out book. As I zipped the bag shut, I looked around my beautiful home. They thought they could walk in here and take my life. They thought my success was something they could just harvest for their own greed. I slung the bag over my shoulder and headed for the back door. I had survived the night, and I had survived the morning. Now, it was time to go on the offensive. It was time to find out exactly who Maya was and how Julian had managed to bury her so completely. I walked out the back gate into the alleyway, ready to meet Silas. The morning air was sharp and biting as I slipped through the back alley behind my townhouse, my duffel bag pulled tight against my shoulder. I kept my head down, weaving through the narrow side streets, until I reached the nearest subway station. I paid for a token with the cash I had taken from my emergency stash, avoiding the digital kiosks, and boarded the southbound train. My destination was the downtown Greyhound bus terminal, a place loud and chaotic enough to swallow me whole. The terminal smelled of diesel exhaust, stale pretzels, and cheap floor cleaner. It was a massive, echoing cavern filled with weary travelers sleeping on plastic chairs and the constant garbled drone of departure announcements. It was the perfect place to disappear. I pulled my oversized hoodie closer around my face and navigated the crowded concourse following the overhead signs pointing toward the short-term luggage storage. I found the wall of dented gray metal lockers tucked away in a dimly lit corridor near the restrooms. I walked down the row, my eyes scanning the faded black numbers painted on the doors. 400, 401, 402. I stopped. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the crumpled white napkin from the restaurant. Comb 814. I reached out and spun the small metal dials on the built-in combination lock. 8, 1, 4. I grabbed the cold metal handle and pulled. The locker door popped open with a hollow metallic click. Sitting alone in the dark, empty space was a thick, heavy manila envelope secured with a red string tie. I reached in and pulled it out. The weight of it in my hands felt immense. It was the physical weight of a ghost. I expected you to be here an hour ago. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Standing 10 feet behind me, half hidden in the shadows of the corridor, was Silas. He wore the same faded wool coat he had on at the restaurant, but in the harsh fluorescent light of the terminal he looked even older. His eyes were deeply sunken, carrying a profound, quiet exhaustion that only comes from unimaginable grief. "I had a minor pest control issue at my house this morning," I replied, my voice remarkably steady. "But I handled it." Silas gave a slow, grim nod. He stepped forward, his eyes dropping to the thick envelope in my hands. "I was a private investigator in Chicago for 30 years, he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "I spent my entire career tracking down cheating spouses, missing assets, and corporate frauds. But I could not see the predator standing right in my own living room until it was entirely too late." I looked at the envelope. "Maya," I said softly. "My daughter," Silas answered. His voice cracked on the word, a raw, devastated sound that echoed off the tile walls. She was 28 years old, brilliant, beautiful. She had just made partner at a top-tier marketing firm. She met Julian at a charity gala I practically forced her to attend. He swept her off her feet. He was charming, wealthy, respectful. The perfect man. 6 months later, they were engaged. 7 months later, she was dead. I felt a cold chill wash over my skin. Silas gestured his head toward the main terminal. "There is a diner across the street," he said. "It is loud and nobody pays attention to anyone else. We can talk there." I followed him out of the bus terminal and into a cramped, greasy spoon diner that smelled of burnt coffee and frying bacon. We slid into a cracked vinyl booth in the far back corner. A tired waitress dropped off 2 mugs of black coffee and walked away without saying a word. I placed the manila envelope on the sticky formica table. I unspooled the red string and opened the flap. "I am an auditor. I have spent my entire adult life reviewing documents, searching for the hidden narratives buried in ledgers and tax returns. But pulling the contents out of this envelope was the hardest thing I had ever done in my professional career." The first document was a certified copy of an autopsy report from the Cook County Medical Examiner. I scanned the rigid clinical text. Maya had collapsed in her kitchen on a Tuesday evening. Julian had been the one to call the paramedics, claiming he found her unresponsive. The official cause of death was listed as acute myocardial infarction, a massive sudden heart attack. "She was 28, I whispered, looking up at Silas. "Healthy 28-year-old women do not just drop dead from heart attacks." Silas gripped his coffee mug, his knuckles turning white. "I know that. You know that. But the toxicology screen came back completely clean. No illicit drugs, no common poisons." Julian played the devastated, weeping fiancé perfectly. He held my hand at the hospital. He cried on my shoulder. And then, before I could even process the shock, he had her cremated. He claimed it was her explicit wish to not be embalmed. By the time I started asking questions, the physical evidence was entirely reduced to ash. I looked back down at the file. Underneath the medical examiner report was a stack of financial records. This was Silas's life work as a private investigator, and it was the exact language I spoke fluently. I began flipping through the bank statements, credit card bills, and wire transfer receipts. The pattern was so brutally identical to my own situation that it made my stomach turn. Julian had isolated her finances almost immediately after the engagement. There were massive withdrawals from Maya's investment accounts, cleverly disguised as joint investments in Kendrick's fake real estate development firm. Julian had systematically drained her liquid assets, moving the money through a labyrinth of shell companies stationed in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. "He bled her dry," I said, my eyes rapidly scanning the routing numbers. "He took exactly $400,000 from her over the span of 3 months. That was just the appetizer," Silas said bitterly. "Keep reading." I pulled the last document from the bottom of the stack. It was a 40-page legal contract printed on heavy premium paper. I looked at the header and felt the breath completely leave my lungs. It was a life insurance policy. Julian had not just stolen Maya's savings. He had engineered the ultimate payout. I flipped to the declaration page. The coverage amount was staggering: $5 million. The policy was a specialized expedited term life agreement, the kind that requires aggressive premium payments, but skips the lengthy medical underwriting process. I looked at the signature line at the bottom of the page. Maya's neat, elegant handwriting was there in blue ink right next to Julian's bold signature, and right beneath that was the date of execution. I did the math in my head, comparing the date on the contract to the date on the autopsy report. "She signed this exactly 3 weeks before she died," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Silas nodded, a single tear escaping his eye and tracking down his weathered cheek. He was the sole beneficiary. Because they were not legally married yet, the insurance company tried to fight the payout. But Julian had Kendrick's high-priced lawyers threaten them with a massive bad faith lawsuit. The insurance company settled. Julian walked away with $5 million tax-free, and 2 weeks later he packed up his apartment, left Chicago, and completely vanished. It took me 2 years to track him down to Atlanta. By the time I found him, he was already putting a wedding ring on your finger. I sat back against the vinyl booth, the sheer scale of the sociopathy washing over me. Julian was not just a con artist. He was a highly organized, completely ruthless serial black widow. He hunted successful independent African American women. He used his charm to bypass our defenses, isolated our finances, and then murdered us for the insurance payouts to fund his family's luxurious lifestyle. Evelyn Kendrick and Chloe were not just enabling him. They were the board of directors of a murder-for-hire syndicate. They lived in mansions and drove luxury SUVs paid for with the blood money of Julian's dead wives. "Did you sign one?" Silas asked quietly, pulling me from my thoughts. "Did he make you sign a policy?" I closed my eyes, my mind racing back to the chaotic weeks right before our wedding. Kendrick had brought over a mountain of paperwork regarding the family trust and our new joint liabilities. Julian had poured me a glass of wine, rubbed my shoulders, and joked about how boring the legal process was. He had handed me a stack of signature pages, kissing my neck while I blindly signed the documents he claimed were standard marital disclosures. "Yes," I said, opening my eyes. "I am a forensic accountant, and I broke the cardinal rule. I signed a stack of legal documents without reading the fine print because I trusted the man holding the pen. He probably took out a policy on me worth double what he got for Maya." "That is why he tried to kill you last night," Silas said. "He accelerated his timeline. You are too smart. He knew you would start noticing the missing $50,000 from your savings. He needed you dead before you could audit your own marriage." I looked at the autopsy report again, the clean toxicology screen, the sudden heart attack. Julian had access to a fast metabolizing agent, something completely untraceable by standard medical examiners. That was the cloudy white powder at the bottom of my champagne glass. I carefully stacked the documents and placed them back into the manila envelope. I tied the red string tightly. The fear that had been gripping my chest since last night was completely gone, replaced by a cold, highly calculated fury. Julian thought he could outsmart me. He thought I was just another mark, another payout waiting to be collected. "What are you going to do?" Silas asked, watching my face intently. I slid the envelope into my duffel bag and zipped it shut. "I am going to do what I do best, Silas. I am going to audit him. I am going to find the shell companies. I am going to find the life insurance policy, and I am going to find the paper trail tying his entire family to Maya's murder." I stood up from the booth, throwing a $5 bill onto the table for the coffee. "I am going back into that house," I said, looking down at the grieving father who had just handed me the key to my own survival. "I am going to play the broken, paranoid wife. And then I am going to burn his entire fake empire right to the ground." I left Silas at the diner and took a cab straight to the financial district. My firm occupied the top 2 floors of a sleek glass high-rise in the heart of downtown Atlanta. This was my territory. I had earned my name on the frosted glass doors through years of relentless grinding, outsmarting corporate tax evaders, and building an untouchable reputation. Julian and his family thought they could dictate the terms of my life, but stepping out of the elevator and onto the plush carpet of my office lobby, I felt my power completely return. I walked past the reception desk, offering a brief nod to my executive assistant, Marcus. I did not bother explaining my oversized thrift store hoodie or my sudden reappearance. I walked straight into my corner office, locked the heavy oak door behind me, and sat down at my massive mahogany desk. I booted up my secure terminal and inserted the encrypted flash drive I had taken from my townhouse. My first priority was securing my clients. If Julian managed to forge a medical proxy, he could potentially attempt to access my firm's master accounts. I initiated a total lockdown protocol on my professional credentials, transferring my active case files to an offline server and revoking all external access permissions tied to my name. Next, I opened a backdoor search into the corporate registry network. I needed to map every single shell company connected to Kendrick's boutique law firm. Apex Holdings was just a single thread, and I was about to pull the entire sweater apart. I was 20 minutes deep into tracing a massive web of offshore wire transfers when a sudden sharp commotion erupted outside my office door. I paused, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. The heavy oak door muffled the sound, but I could hear Marcus's voice raised in frantic protest. A second later, the door handle violently rattled. When it did not open, someone began pounding on the solid wood with the flat of their hand. "Simone, open this door right now!" It was Evelyn. Her voice was shrill, echoing loudly enough to carry through the entire executive corridor. I saved my progress, ejected the flash drive, and slipped it into my pocket. I stood up, smoothed down the front of my hoodie, and walked over to the door. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled it open. Evelyn and Chloe burst into my office like a localized hurricane. Marcus stood right behind them, his face flushed with panic, holding a phone in his hand. "I am so sorry," Simone Marcus stammered. "They refused to wait at reception. They just pushed right past the security desk." "It is fine, Marcus," I said calmly, not breaking eye contact with Evelyn. "Call building security. Tell them we have 2 unauthorized trespassers on the floor who need an immediate escort to the street level." Evelyn's face contorted into a mask of pure vicious outrage. "Do not you dare call security on me!" she shrieked, whirling around to face the open doorway. Several of my junior accountants and 2 of my senior partners had stepped out of their offices, drawn by the yelling. This was exactly what Evelyn wanted. She had failed to kidnap me at the townhouse, so she had pivoted to a public execution of my professional character. "You need to step down, Simone," Evelyn yelled, ensuring her voice bounced off the glass walls for maximum audience reach. "You are completely out of your mind. You are having a severe psychotic break, and you are embezzling from our family trust to fund your delusions." Chloe stepped forward, her arms crossed tight over her designer blouse, playing the role of the deeply concerned relative to absolute perfection. "We tried to handle this privately," she announced to the gathering crowd of my colleagues. "We really did. But Simone has been stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from Julian. She is completely unstable. We are just trying to protect her clients before she destroys this entire firm." I stood behind my desk perfectly still, watching them perform. It was a spectacular display of weaponized white tears from Chloe and aristocratic indignation from Evelyn. They were trying to trigger a reaction. They wanted me to scream back. They wanted me to defend myself loudly, to throw my hands in the air, to look exactly like the unhinged, dangerous black woman they were aggressively painting me to be. If I lost my temper, my partners would see a liability. If I engaged in a shouting match, Evelyn would win. So I did not give them a single ounce of emotion. I picked up my desk phone and pressed the intercom button. "Marcus," I said, my voice projecting clearly and calmly into the hallway. "Please inform the partners that my mother-in-law and sister-in-law are currently experiencing a severe emotional crisis. I apologize for the disruption to the workday." "How dare you?" Evelyn gasped, her eyes going wide with shock. "You are the one who is crazy. You are stealing from my son." "Evelyn," I said, my tone as cold and hard as absolute zero. "If you have evidence of embezzlement, you should contact the federal authorities immediately. I highly encourage it. In fact, I am fully prepared to open my books to the IRS today. Are you and Kendrick prepared to do the same for Apex Holdings?" The blood instantly drained from Evelyn's face. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked at Chloe, panic suddenly shattering her sophisticated facade. I had just named their secret shell company in front of a dozen financial auditors. Chloe dropped her arms, her fake concern vanishing. "You cannot just throw out baseless accusations," Chloe snapped, taking a step back toward the door. "They are not baseless," I replied smoothly. "But this is a private financial firm, not a country club for you to throw tantrums in. You have exactly 10 seconds to leave my office before the armed guards arrive and drag you out by your expensive hair." Right on cue, the heavy glass doors of the lobby swung open and 3 large building security officers in dark uniforms marched down the hallway. Marcus pointed directly at Evelyn and Chloe. "Ma'am," the lead officer said, stepping into my office and placing a firm hand on Evelyn's shoulder. "You need to come with us right now." "Get your hands off me," Evelyn shrieked, swatting at the officer. The illusion of the wealthy, composed matriarch completely evaporated. She began thrashing her designer handbag, swinging wildly and knocking a crystal paperweight off the edge of my desk. It hit the floor with a loud crack. Do you know who I am? She screamed, her voice cracking with hysterical rage. My son owns half of this city. You cannot touch me. The officers were completely unimpressed. Two of them grabbed Evelyn by the arms, efficiently lifting her off her feet as she kicked and screamed obscenities. Chloe did not wait to be grabbed. She shrank back, her face pale, and practically sprinted down the hallway to escape the humiliation of being physically removed. I watched in total silence as they hauled Evelyn through the lobby, her shrieks echoing all the way to the elevator banks. When the doors finally slid shut, the sudden silence in the office was deafening. I walked out from behind my desk and looked at my partners, who were standing in the hallway looking entirely stunned. I adjusted the cuffs of my hoodie and offered them a tight, professional smile. I am taking a brief leave of absence to handle a hostile domestic situation, I told them, projecting absolute authority. My files are locked, my clients are secure, and my assistant has my emergency contact protocols. If anyone from my husband's family attempts to contact this firm again, you are to immediately involve corporate counsel and file a restraining order. Are we clear? My senior partner, a man who had mentored me for 5 years, gave a slow, respectful nod. Crystal clear, Simone. Do what you need to do. I turned around, walked back into my office, and shut the door. I had protected my sanctuary. I had publicly neutralized their narrative of my insanity. But I knew the war was far from over. I grabbed my duffel bag and headed for the private executive stairwell. It was time to pull the trigger on Chloe's threat and find out exactly what kind of prenup I had actually signed. I stopped on the landing of the executive stairwell, the heavy steel door clicking shut behind me. The adrenaline from the confrontation in my office lobby was beginning to recede, leaving behind a cold, sharp clarity. Chloe had not just been throwing insults to hurt my feelings when she had cornered me in my living room earlier that morning. She had been actively telegraphing their entire legal strategy. Before the security guards had dragged Evelyn away, Chloe's vicious sneer echoed in my mind. You really should have read that prenup closer, sweetie. I turned around, walked down one flight of stairs, and let myself into the firm's windowless, heavily secured basement server room. I locked the solid metal door, sat down at the emergency standalone terminal, and plugged in my encrypted flash drive. I opened the digital PDF file of the prenuptial agreement Julian and his high-priced lawyers had practically shoved in my face the week of our wedding. I had skimmed it at the time, completely trusting his smooth, romantic assurances that it was just standard boilerplate language designed to protect both of our premarital assets. Now reading it with the forensic eyes of an auditor hunting a killer, the trap was glaringly obvious. Buried on page 42, hidden beneath dense paragraphs of incredibly dry legalese regarding property division, was a medical incapacitation clause. It was not standard. It was absolute poison. The clause stated that if either spouse was deemed medically or psychologically unfit by a single licensed physician, the other spouse would immediately be granted irrevocable comprehensive power of attorney. There was no required waiting period. There was no mandate for a secondary medical opinion or a court order. If Julian's hired goons had managed to drag me out of my house and into their private facility this morning, a doctor on their payroll would have signed a single piece of paper. With that one signature, Julian would have gained total unchecked access to my personal bank accounts, my business assets, and my real estate. He could have legally liquidated my entire life before I even woke up from whatever sedatives they forced into my veins. I closed the document, my jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. Julian had built the perfect safety net. If he could not poison me quietly at the restaurant, he was going to erase me legally through the psychiatric system. But why the sudden urgency? Julian had spent an entire year carefully grooming me, building the flawless illusion of a wealthy, successful power couple. Why accelerate the timeline so recklessly and risk a messy, violent extraction at my townhouse? Murder and kidnapping were acts of sheer desperation. I needed to know exactly what was driving that desperation. I opened a secure, encrypted portal that tapped directly into the international corporate registry databases. It was time to find out exactly who this family really was. I started with Apex Holdings, LLC, the shell company that had swallowed my $50,000. I traced the routing numbers through the Delaware State Registry, peeling back the layers of corporate anonymity. Apex Holdings was a subsidiary of a holding group called Blue Ridge Capital. Blue Ridge Capital, in turn, was the primary asset manager for the family trust. I pulled the financial filings for the family trust and Kendrick's real estate development firm. Julian and Kendrick drove $100,000 cars. Evelyn lived in a massive, sprawling estate in Buckhead and wore custom designer clothing to Sunday service. Chloe spent her weekends sipping mimosas at the most exclusive country clubs in the state. They projected an image of untouchable generational Black wealth. I bypassed their public relations facades and looked directly at the raw numbers. The data did not lie, and the realization hit me like a physical blow. They were broke. They were not just experiencing a temporary cash flow problem, they were utterly, catastrophically bankrupt. I scrolled through page after page of glaring red ink. Kendrick's flagship real estate firm had not successfully closed a single commercial development project in 4 years. Every single property they claimed to own was leveraged to the absolute limit. They had taken out massive high-interest loans against their existing properties to fund their lavish lifestyle, and those loans were actively defaulting. I pulled up the deed to Evelyn's magnificent Buckhead estate. It was currently sitting in pre-foreclosure. She was 3 months behind on her mortgage payments, and the bank was preparing to seize the property within the next 60 days. Chloe's exclusive country club memberships were suspended for non-payment. Kendrick was facing multiple civil lawsuits from unpaid contractors and angry investors demanding their capital back. They were a walking Ponzi scheme. The only reason the entire family had not collapsed under the weight of their massive debt 3 years ago was because of a sudden miraculous injection of exactly $5 million in liquid cash. I cross-referenced the dates on the ledgers. The massive cash deposit into their family trust aligned perfectly with the payout from Maya's life insurance policy. The sickening truth finally crystallized in my mind. Julian was not a successful real estate developer. He was the family's designated hitman. He was their golden goose. Whenever the loans came due and the facade of their wealth began to crumble, Julian went hunting. He found an independent, successful woman. He charmed her, married her, isolated her, and then murdered her to harvest her assets and pay his family's debts. Maya's tragic death had bought them 3 years of luxury, but they had burned through her blood money, and now the collectors were knocking on the door again. I sat back in the glow of the computer monitor, the sheer, breathtaking evil of their operation washing over me. They looked down on me because of my working-class background. Chloe had sat in my living room drinking my coffee, calling me ghetto and unhinged, acting as if I were a stain on their pristine high society reputation. But behind their tailored suits and designer bags, they were nothing but glamorous parasites. They were desperate drowning frauds who survived entirely by draining the lifeblood of women who actually worked for a living. My $50,000 bridge loan was not going toward a new zoning permit. It was a desperate last-minute patch to keep Kendrick's creditors from filing criminal fraud charges against him this week. Julian had tried to poison me at dinner because Evelyn's house was about to be seized by the bank. My murder was nothing more than a scheduled financial transaction to balance their corrupted ledgers. I ejected my flash drive and powered down the terminal. The fear and shock that had kept me running since the restaurant were entirely burned away, replaced by an absolute freezing resolve. I knew their secrets. I knew their vulnerabilities. They desperately needed my money to survive, and they were running out of time. If I stayed hidden, they would eventually find me, or they would find a judge to execute the power of attorney in my absence. I could not hide. I had to go back. I had to walk directly back into the lion's den, look my husband in the eye, and pretend his little intervention had worked. I was going to use their own desperation against them, and I was going to make sure that when their fake empire finally fell, they would all be buried underneath it. I walked out of the glass doors of my office building and immediately hailed a cab to take me back to my townhouse. The ride across the city gave me 20 minutes to completely bury the fierce, competent professional I was and resurrect the terrified, broken woman Julian needed me to be. I had to look like a complete mess. I rubbed my eyes forcefully until the whites were entirely bloodshot and puffy. I kept the oversized cheap thrift store hoodie pulled tight around my shoulders. I had spent my entire adult life learning how to project strength, how to command a boardroom, and how to never show an ounce of weakness. Now my survival depended entirely on my ability to surrender all of that. When the cab pulled up to my street, I saw Kendrick's black SUV was gone, but Julian's sleek sports car was parked directly in the driveway. He had come back. He was waiting for me. He could not afford to let his $5 million payout simply walk away without a fight. I walked up the driveway and unlocked the front door. The house was dead quiet. The shattered ceramic from Chloe's coffee mug had been neatly swept away, leaving no physical trace of the morning's violent confrontation. Julian was sitting on my custom velvet sofa. He held a crystal glass of dark bourbon in his right hand. He was staring blankly into the unlit fireplace. The moment the front door clicked shut, he stood up. His posture was totally rigid. His jaw was locked tight. He was ready for a war. He was ready to call the police himself, have them drag me out, and use my disappearance as proof of my mental decline. I did not give him a single second to execute his plan. I dropped my duffel bag onto the hardwood floor. It hit the ground with a heavy thud. I let out a loud, pathetic, trembling sob. I collapsed to my knees right there in the entryway foyer. I buried my face in my hands and began to weep violently. It was not a quiet, dignified cry. It was a messy, gasping, total breakdown. "I am so sorry," I wailed, letting my voice crack and pitch upward. "I am so sorry, Julian." "You were right. You were right about everything." Julian completely froze. The calculated anger in his eyes flickered instantly, replaced by a cautious, arrogant surprise. I kept crying, forcing the tears to stream rapidly down my cheeks. "I do not know what is wrong with me," I babbled, wrapping my arms tightly around my own torso. "The stress from the firm is destroying me. The audits, the long hours, the lack of sleep. I thought people were following me yesterday. I thought you were trying to hurt me at the restaurant. I was so scared. I do not want to be crazy, Julian. Please do not let them lock me away. Please forgive me." I sounded completely pathetic. I sounded entirely broken. And it was the sweetest music his massive narcissistic ego could ever hear. He set his bourbon glass down on the console table and walked quickly over to me. He knelt on the floor and pulled me forcefully against his chest. I had to use every ounce of willpower in my body not to physically recoil from his touch. I pressed my face against his expensive designer shirt, breathing in the scent of his cologne, knowing with absolute certainty that he was a murderer. "Shh," he murmured, stroking the back of my head. "It is okay, Simone. I am here. I am not going to let anyone hurt you. We are going to get you the help you need." I nodded frantically against his chest. I told him I would sign whatever medical proxy documents he needed. I told him I trusted him to take over my accounting firm temporarily until I was better. I handed him the keys to my entire life on a silver platter, knowing full well I had already locked down my accounts and changed all the digital locks. He helped me up from the floor, his arm wrapped tightly around my waist, and led me to the couch. He poured me a glass of cold water and played the role of the devoted, tragic caregiver. He promised me he would call off the private doctors for now, as long as I promised to rest and let him handle my financial affairs. I promised. I played the exhausted, heavily medicated wife to absolute perfection. After an hour of holding my hand and whispering sweet, empty lies, Julian finally let out a long sigh. He rolled his shoulders backward, pretending the emotional toll of dealing with my insanity was weighing heavily on his body. "I'm going to take a quick shower," he said, kissing my forehead softly. "You just lay here and relax. I will order some expensive takeout for us. Just rest your mind, my love." I nodded slowly, closing my eyes and pulling a thick throw blanket up to my chin. I listened closely as his footsteps ascended the hardwood stairs. I heard the heavy door of our master bathroom click shut. A few seconds later, the distinct rushing sound of the shower turning on echoed through the plumbing. The exact moment the water hit the shower tiles, my eyes snapped open. I threw the blanket off my body and moved with silent, practiced speed. I grabbed my duffel bag from the foyer and pulled out my specialized encrypted flash drive. Julian was arrogant, but he was also incredibly careful. He never left his personal laptop lying around the house. He kept it locked inside a heavy leather briefcase inside his home office. I jogged silently up the carpeted stairs, bypassing the master bedroom and slipping directly into the guest room he had converted into his private workspace. The leather briefcase was sitting exactly where I expected, resting on the center of his mahogany desk. He had locked it with a 3-digit combination dial. But Julian was a creature of extreme vanity. I spun the tiny metal dials to his own birth month and day. The brass latches popped open with a loud click. I pulled out his sleek silver laptop and set it flat on the desk. I did not bother trying to guess his password. I am a forensic accountant. I hunt white-collar criminals for a living, and I came fully prepared with military-grade extraction tools. I inserted my flash drive into the side port of his laptop and executed a forced boot sequence. By bypassing his operating system entirely, I prevented his tracking software from logging my activity. The bright screen went completely dark, then loaded a black command terminal directly from my drive. I quickly typed in a series of commands to initiate a direct sector-by-sector physical clone of his entire hard drive. This would not just copy his visible files, it would copy his hidden partitions, his encrypted folders, and every single deleted communication he thought he had wiped from the disk. A bright green progress bar appeared on the black screen. 10%, 20%. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the faint, high-pitched hum of the computer fan and the distant sound of the shower running down the hall. My heart beat in a slow, steady rhythm. I was not afraid. I was intensely focused. 40%. I knew this laptop held the entire digital blueprint of his crimes. It held the truth about Apex Holdings, the offshore accounts he used to hide Maya's life insurance money, and the exact plans he had made with Chloe and Kendrick to dispose of my body. 60%. The water down the hall suddenly shut off. I froze instantly. The rushing sound of the shower had stopped. I heard the faint squeak of the glass shower door sliding open. 80%. Come on, I whispered to the glowing screen. I heard Julian walking heavily across the bathroom floor tiles. He would be grabbing a towel. He would be drying off. He would be putting on his silk robe. 95%. The green bar crept forward with agonizing slowness. 100%. Clone complete. I yanked the flash drive out of the side port. I slammed the silver laptop shut, shoved it roughly back into the leather briefcase, and spun the brass combination dials to scramble the numbers. I grabbed my drive, slipped out of the office, and sprinted silently down the carpeted stairs. I tossed the flash drive deep into my duffel bag, threw myself back onto the velvet sofa, and pulled the thick blanket completely over my shoulders. Less than 15 seconds later, Julian walked down the stairs, casually tying the belt of his dark silk robe. He looked over at the couch. I fluttered my eyes open, offering him a weak, exhausted smile. He smiled back, completely unaware that I had just stolen the digital keys to his entire fake empire, and his absolute destruction was now sitting safely in my bag. By the time Sunday evening rolled around, I had perfected the role of the heavily medicated, deeply unstable wife. Julian had spent the last 2 days treating me like a fragile piece of glass, monitoring my every move and offering fake, soothing words while I played the part of a woman entirely detached from reality. He thought he had completely broken me. He had absolutely no idea that his cloned hard drive was currently sitting in a secure lockbox at my bank, and I had spent the weekend decrypting every single one of his deleted text messages. Julian drove us to Evelyn's sprawling estate in Buckhead for their mandatory Sunday family dinner. As his sleek sports car rolled up the long, sweeping circular driveway, I looked out the window at the massive brick mansion. It looked like a fortress of absolute wealth. The manicured hedges were perfectly trimmed, the towering white columns pristine, and the imported luxury cars belonging to Kendrick and Chloe were parked casually out front. To anyone else in Atlanta, this was the pinnacle of high society. But I knew the truth. I knew the bank had already issued the final notice of default. I knew the landscaping company had not been paid in 4 months. I was walking into a monument of crushing debt hosted by a family of desperate frauds. Julian parked the car, hurried around to my side, and opened the door. He offered me his hand, playing the attentive husband. I took it, keeping my shoulders slumped and my gaze aimed at the ground. We walked through the heavy double doors, and were immediately greeted by the smell of roasted lamb garlic and expensive red wine. Evelyn was waiting in the grand foyer, dressed in a stunning silk gown, a string of heavy pearls resting against her collarbone. She smiled when she saw me, but it was a cold, predatory smile. She swept forward and kissed the air right next to my cheek. "Simone, darling." Evelyn purred, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "I am so glad you felt well enough to join us tonight. Julian told us you have been resting your mind." I gave a weak, vacuous nod. "Thank you for having me, Evelyn." We moved into the formal dining room. The long mahogany table was set to absolute perfection. Crystal water goblets caught the light from the massive chandelier overhead. Heavy silver cutlery framed gold-rimmed china plates. Kendrick sat at one side of the table wearing a tailored suit, swirling a glass of Cabernet. Chloe sat next to him, her blonde hair perfectly blown out, wearing a diamond tennis bracelet that I now knew was purchased using Maya's life insurance money. The dinner proceeded with sickening normalcy. We ate the roasted lamb and wild mushroom risotto, while Kendrick bragged loudly about a new commercial zoning project his firm was supposedly acquiring. It was a complete fabrication. I had seen his ledgers. His firm had zero capital and zero active acquisitions. He was performing for me, maintaining the illusion of the wealthy, successful businessman to justify what they were about to ask of me. As the hired catering staff cleared the dinner plates and poured the coffee, the atmosphere in the room suddenly shifted. The casual banter died down. Kendrick adjusted his posture, sitting up completely straight. Julian placed his hand over mine on the table, rubbing my knuckles with his thumb. Evelyn dabbed the corners of her mouth with a linen napkin, took a slow sip of her coffee, and turned her sharp, calculating eyes directly onto me. "Simone, sweetie," Evelyn began, her voice dropping to a low, maternal register. "We have all been so terribly worried about you this week. Seeing you suffer under the weight of your business has broken our hearts. Family is supposed to protect family, and we feel we have failed to protect you from your own ambition." I looked at her blankly, waiting for the trap to spring. Julian and Kendrick had a long meeting with the family trust lawyers. On Friday, Evelyn continued, reaching down to a small side table next to her chair. She pulled out a thick manila folder and placed it squarely on the polished mahogany table. She slid it across the smooth wood until it came to a stop directly in front of my coffee cup. "We want to take the burden off your shoulders. We want you to focus entirely on your mental health, without the crushing stress of property management." I looked down at the folder. I did not need to open it to know what it was, but I slowly reached out and flipped the heavy cover back anyway. Sitting on top of the stack of legal papers was a standard quitclaim deed. It was a legally binding document that would permanently transfer the entire ownership of my townhouse from my name directly into the control of Blue Ridge Capital. They were not just trying to manage my property. They were trying to steal the deed so Kendrick could instantly use my fully paid-off townhouse as collateral against his defaulting commercial loans. I stared at the paper, letting my hands tremble just slightly. "But I paid for that house with my own money," I whispered, injecting a perfect note of childlike confusion into my voice. Chloe let out a loud, patronizing sigh and leaned across the table. Her diamond bracelet clinked sharply against her crystal water glass. "Oh, Simone, please do not make this difficult. We are trying to help you. You are just too unstable right now to handle your own portfolio." Chloe took a sip of her wine and looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated condescension. "It is completely understandable, really. Someone with your background coming from such blue-collar roots, you just do not have the generational knowledge to manage real estate assets properly. You grind and you work, but you do not know how to build a legacy. It is too much pressure for you. That is why your mind is fracturing. You need to let the men in the family manage the big picture. Julian and Kendrick know what they are doing. You just need to sit back and be a wife. The blatant aggressive racism wrapped up in fake concern was almost physically suffocating. Chloe was sitting in a foreclosed mansion, married to a man facing civil fraud lawsuits, lecturing me about financial literacy because she thought my working-class background made me inherently inferior. She genuinely believed she was entitled to the wealth I had built from the ground up, simply because she had married into a family that projected a better image. Kendrick leaned forward, resting his heavy forearms on the table. He looked at me with a stern, authoritative expression. Chloe is right, Simone. You have a nice little townhouse, but it is just sitting there. Under the family trust, I can leverage that property, fold it into my new commercial acquisition, and triple your equity in 6 months. We are actually doing you a massive favor, but we need to move fast. The market waits for no one. Julian squeezed my hand, leaning close to my ear. His breath was warm against my skin. Just sign the paper, my love. It is just temporary. Just until the doctors say you are fully recovered. I promise you I will take care of everything. He reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket, pulled out a heavy, solid gold fountain pen, and placed it gently on top of the quitclaim deed. The entire table fell completely silent. 4 pairs of eyes were locked onto me. The predators had officially cornered their prey. They needed this signature tonight. They needed the equity in my home to stop the bank from seizing Evelyn's estate. Their desperation was palpable, radiating off them in waves. If I refused to sign, if I stood up and told them no, the fragile, crazy wife act would instantly shatter. They would realize I was lucid, and they would immediately revert to their backup plan of physically forcing me into a psychiatric facility. I looked at the gold pen. I looked at the signature line on the deed. I could feel Julian's pulse beating steadily against my hand. I slowly reached out. My fingers brushed the cold metal of the pen. Evelyn leaned forward eagerly, her eyes gleaming with absolute greed. Chloe smiled a smug, victorious smile. I picked up the pen. I brought it down to the paper. The gold tip hovered a millimeter above the signature line. Then I let the pen slip from my fingers. It clattered loudly onto the china plate. I pulled my hands back and pressed them against my temples, squeezing my eyes shut. I let out a sharp, ragged gasp, rocking back and forth in my chair. I cannot see the words, I cried out, my voice high and panicked. The letters are moving around the page. Everything is blurry. Julian stiffened next to me. Simone, stop it. Just sign your name. I cannot, I sobbed, letting the tears spill over my eyelashes and run down my cheeks. My hands are shaking too much. My head is pounding. I do not understand what this paper says. The doctor said I am not supposed to look at legal documents when my anxiety is this high. You promised you would not stress me out today, Julian. You promised. I buried my face in my hands and began to hyperventilate loudly. It was a spectacular performance. I was using their own weaponized narrative against them. They had spent the entire week convincing me and the world that I was completely unhinged. Now they were trapped by their own lie. A legally binding deed transfer signed by a woman actively hyperventilating and crying about hallucinations would be instantly thrown out by any competent notary or judge. Evelyn slammed her hand down on the mahogany table. The silverware rattled. For God's sake, Simone, pull yourself together and sign the document. Mom, stop, Julian snapped, standing up quickly. He could see that pushing me further right now would completely break my fragile state and ruin the legality of the document. He pulled my chair back and wrapped his arms around me, pulling me up from the table. She is having an episode. The medication is making her blurry. Kendrick let out a loud, frustrated curse, tossing his napkin onto his plate. This is ridiculous, Julian. We need that equity release by Tuesday morning. I will get her to sign it tomorrow when she is calm. Julian fired back, shooting his brother a warning look. Just back off. I buried my face into Julian's shoulder, sobbing quietly, while internally, my mind was cold, sharp, and calculating. I had bought myself the time I needed. I had secured the 24 hours required to execute my final strike. I let Julian guide me away from the dining table, leaving the unsigned deed sitting next to the roasted lamb. They thought they were sending a broken woman home to rest. They had no idea they were sending an auditor home to finalize their absolute destruction. Julian had his hand firmly pressed against the small of my back, guiding me away from the dining room and toward the grand foyer of the estate. I took 3 steps before I suddenly stopped, planting my heels into the imported rug. I let out a long, shuddering breath and aggressively wiped the tears from my cheeks with the back of my hand. "I am being ridiculous," I whispered, forcing a weak, deeply embarrassed laugh. "I do not want to ruin Sunday dinner for everyone. Just put the legal papers away, Evelyn. Please. I just want to sit down and finish my food." Julian hesitated, his grip tightening defensively on my waist. He wanted me out of that house before I caused a larger scene. But Evelyn, ever the pragmatist who hated the idea of an expensive catered meal going to waste, immediately nodded from the head of the table. "Of course," darling Evelyn said smoothly, though her eyes were sharp with irritation. "The business can wait until tomorrow. Sit down and nourish yourself." I turned around, walked back to my chair and sat down. Kendrick snatched the unsigned quitclaim deed off the table and shoved it roughly back into the thick manila folder, his face red with barely suppressed rage. Chloe rolled her eyes, let out a loud huff of annoyance, and took a massive gulp of her red wine. I picked up my heavy silver knife and fork and began calmly cutting my roasted lamb. The juxtaposition of my sudden quiet composure against my previous hysterical breakdown was entirely deliberate. I needed them completely off balance for what I was about to do. "I am so sorry for the outburst," I said softly, chewing a small bite of meat and looking down at my plate. "It is just work. The stress of this new contract is bleeding heavily into my personal life." Chloe slammed her wineglass down onto the table. "Then quit, Simone," she snapped, abandoning her fake sympathy entirely. "Julian makes more than enough money to support you. You do not need to be running a firm if it is making you act this crazy." "I cannot quit," I replied, taking a slow sip of my ice water. "The IRS specifically requested my firm to handle this audit. It is a massive offshore real estate fraud case. The federal agents are breathing down my neck, and it is just so much data to process." Kendrick stopped chewing. His knife hovered motionless over his plate. "The IRS." He repeated, his voice suddenly lacking its usual arrogant boom. "Yes," I continued casually, waving my hand dismissively, as if I were talking about the weather. "It is a fascinating case, really. A local holding group has been actively funneling millions of dollars through a Delaware shell company to cover their defaulting commercial loans." I paused, letting the silence stretch for one agonizing second. "The exact amount of the primary default is $4.2 million, I said, maintaining a light conversational tone. "They are trying to cover it up by secretly leveraging residential family properties, but their paper trail is incredibly sloppy. The registered agents use their own boutique law firms to set up the ghost corporations. It is amateur hour. The feds are going to freeze all their assets by the end of the month." The dining room went completely terrifyingly silent. The ambient noise of the estate seemed to vanish. No one took a breath. No one moved a muscle. Chloe froze with her glass halfway to her mouth, her eyes wide and panicked. Kendrick dropped his silver fork. It hit his china plate with a loud, sharp clatter that echoed violently in the quiet room. Evelyn stared at me, her jaw completely rigid, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table so tightly her knuckles were white. I slowly turned my head to look at Julian. The perfectly crafted mask of the loving, concerned husband had completely shattered. His face was devoid of all color. His dark eyes were wide and filled with absolute unfiltered terror. He was staring at me as if I had just transformed into a ghost right in front of him. He knew I was the lead auditor on the case. He knew I had just recited the exact financial blueprint of his family's crimes. Anyway, I sighed heavily, putting my fork down and pushing my plate away. Looking at those ledgers all week is what caused my panic attack today. All those millions of dollars in fake assets and hidden debts. It is just depressing how easily people lie to the ones they love. I offered the table a bright, empty smile. But you are right, Julian. I should leave the heavy lifting to the men. My mind is just too fragile for this right now. Nobody ate another bite. The rest of the dinner was a masterclass in suffocating, undeniable tension. Evelyn abruptly announced she had a migraine and excused herself to her bedroom. Kendrick grabbed Chloe by the arm and dragged her out the front door without even saying goodbye. Julian practically sprinted to get our coats. He needed to get me out of that house before his panic completely consumed him. The drive back to our townhouse was dead silent. Julian did not turn on the radio. He gripped the leather steering wheel so hard his hands shook. He kept darting nervous, calculating glances at me from the corner of his eye, trying to figure out if my mention of the $4.2 million was a catastrophic coincidence or a targeted threat. I played the exhausted wife, resting my head against the cool glass of the passenger window and closing my eyes. I had planted the seed. I had let them know that the walls were closing in and their timeline was entirely compromised. Once we were back inside the townhouse, I went straight upstairs and climbed into bed, pulling the heavy duvet over my shoulders. Julian paced the living room downstairs for 2 straight hours. I could hear his heavy footsteps pacing back and forth across the hardwood floor, followed by the muffled sounds of him whispering frantically into his cell phone. He was doing damage control. I waited in the dark until midnight. Finally, Julian came upstairs, slipped into bed beside me, and turned his back to me. I lay perfectly still, matching my breathing to his waiting, until his body went completely limp, and the deep, rhythmic sounds of his sleep filled the room. I slowly slid out from under the covers. I grabbed my duffel bag from the closet and locked myself inside the master bathroom. I turned on the dim vanity light and sat down on the cold marble floor. I pulled out my burner phone and the encrypted flash drive containing the total clone of Julian's laptop. I connected the drive to my phone using a small digital adapter and opened the file directory. I had already seen the financial ledgers, but I knew a man as paranoid and controlling as Julian would not just keep spreadsheets. He would keep leverage. I ran a deep system search for hidden partitions, bypassing the standard operating folders. Deep within a system directory disguised as a mundane audio driver update file, I found exactly what I was looking for. It was a hidden folder containing hundreds of compressed audio files. Julian recorded his phone calls. It was a classic move for a blackmailer and a con artist who needed to keep his lies perfectly straight and hold insurance over his co-conspirators. I put in my wireless earbuds, turning the volume up, and sorted the files by date. I scrolled down to a file time-stamped 3 days ago, recorded just 4 hours before Julian took me to the Michelin star steakhouse for our honeymoon dinner. I took a deep breath, braced myself, and pressed play. Chloe's voice instantly filled my ears, sharp, shrill, and entirely impatient. "Kendrick is losing his mind, Julian," Chloe snapped through the audio recording. "The bank called Evelyn again this morning. They are threatening to send the sheriff to lock the gates of the estate next week. When is this going to be done?" Julian's voice responded. It was smooth, chillingly calm, and completely devoid of any human empathy. "Relax, Chloe. I have the timeline perfectly mapped out. The dinner reservation is for 8 tonight. I have the compound ready." "Are you sure it will look natural?" Chloe demanded, her voice dripping with anxiety. "If the police start asking questions about her money so soon after the wedding, it is going to point straight back to the trust. You know how smart she is. What if she left a paper trail?" "She did not leave a paper trail." Julian laughed, a dark, arrogant sound that made my stomach physically turn. "She trusts me completely. It will be a tragic, sudden heart attack, just like Maya, The medical examiner will not find a single trace of anything in her bloodstream. Once she is pronounced dead at the hospital, the power of attorney transfers to me immediately. I will wire the 4.2 million to Kendrick's firm by the end of the week. Just keep Mom calm and make sure Kendrick does not do anything stupid. Just get it done. Julian. Chloe sighed heavily. I am so tired of pretending to like her. Her whole independent woman routine is exhausting. The audio file clicked off, leaving me sitting in total silence on the bathroom floor. The cold marble pressed against my legs, but I felt completely numb. Hearing the man I married casually guarantee my death was a surreal out-of-body experience. He talked about ending my life with the same casual tone someone would use to order a cup of coffee. I was nothing but a line item on his balance sheet, a temporary obstacle standing between his family and their stolen wealth. But hearing Chloe complain about pretending to like me while actively conspiring to murder me fueled a rage so cold and pure it chased away any remaining trace of fear. They thought I was a fool. They thought my success was something they could simply harvest to pay for their country club memberships and their luxury cars. I locked my phone screen and pulled the earbuds out of my ears. They had handed me the absolute smoking gun. I did not just have evidence of financial fraud anymore. I had a recorded confession of conspiracy to commit murder. Julian had unknowingly documented his own demise. I stood up from the floor, looked at my reflection in the vanity mirror, and made a silent promise to the ghost of Maya. I was not going to be their next victim. I was going to be their executioner. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in psychological endurance. I packed the burner phone and the encrypted flash drive into my secure briefcase at the office, locking it inside a biometric safe that only my fingerprint could open. At home, I continued to play the role of the heavily medicated, deeply paranoid wife. I spent my days curled up on the velvet sofa, staring blankly at the television, jumping at small noises, and apologizing profusely to Julian for my fractured mental state. I watched him seamlessly transition into the role of my savior. He brought me tea, stroked my hair, and assured me that he was handling all the complex legal details of our lives. He was so incredibly confident in his absolute control over me that he never even noticed I had spent my afternoons transferring millions of dollars of my own corporate assets into a blind trust he could never touch, regardless of whatever medical proxy he managed to forge. Friday evening finally arrived. This was the night of the massive charity gala Evelyn had been planning for months. It was hosted in the grand ballroom of the Four Seasons Hotel, a lavish, incredibly expensive event designed to announce Kendrick's supposedly massive new commercial real estate acquisition. In reality, the entire gala was an elaborate smokescreen. It was a desperate public relations stunt to convince their restless investors and angry creditors that the family was still flush with cash. They intended to fund this fake acquisition using the $5 million payout from my impending tragic accident. Julian walked into the master bedroom dressed in a flawless, custom-tailored black tuxedo. He held a small velvet jewelry box in his hands. I was sitting at the vanity wearing a sleek, floor-length black silk gown. I had kept my makeup minimal and my hair pulled back into a severe, elegant chignon. I looked pale, subdued, and perfectly fragile. "You look absolutely breathtaking, my love," Julian murmured, stepping behind me and kissing the bare skin of my shoulder. He opened the velvet box, revealing a stunning diamond necklace. He carefully draped it around my neck, securing the clasp. "Just try to smile tonight, Simone. You do not have to say a single word to anyone. Just stand by my side, let people see how much I love you, and we will leave early so you can rest." I looked at his reflection in the mirror. He was dressing me up for my own funeral. The diamond necklace was not a gift of love. It was a prop to maintain the illusion of his wealth and devotion. I reached up and touched the cold stones, offering him a weak, grateful smile. "Thank you, Julian," I whispered. "I will be good, I promise." We took a private town car to the hotel. When the heavy brass doors of the ballroom swung open, the sheer scale of their financial deception was overwhelming. The room was packed with hundreds of Atlanta's black elite. Politicians, corporate executives, and wealthy socialites mingled under massive crystal chandeliers. Waiters in white coats circulated with trays of vintage champagne and beluga caviar. Evelyn was holding court near the center of the room, wearing a shimmering gold gown, laughing loudly and accepting compliments as if she were royalty. Kendrick was aggressively shaking hands near the open bar, slapping investors on the back, selling the dream of a commercial empire that did not actually exist. Chloe stood by his side, draped in designer silk, looking down her nose at the catering staff. They were burning through credit they did not have completely, relying on the absolute certainty that I would be dead before the final invoices came due. Julian kept a firm, protective hand on the small of my back as we navigated the crowded room. He introduced me to several prominent city council members and wealthy developers. Each time he spoke over me, gently explaining that his brilliant wife was taking a much-needed sabbatical due to severe exhaustion. He played the protective, heartbroken husband so perfectly that several women actually placed their hands over their hearts, offering me looks of deep, genuine pity. I kept my eyes lowered, nodding softly, allowing him to paint me as a tragic figure. At exactly 9 o'clock, the lights in the ballroom dimmed. A spotlight hit the large stage erected at the far end of the room. The low hum of conversation faded as Julian stepped up to the podium. He adjusted the microphone, offering the crowd that signature, devastatingly charming smile that had once convinced me he was the man of my dreams. "Good evening, everyone," Julian began, his deep, resonant voice echoing beautifully through the massive speakers. "Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate not just the future of our city, but the future of our family." The crowd broke into polite applause. Kendrick raised his glass from the front row, grinning broadly. "As many of you know, my brother Kendrick and I are officially breaking ground on a revolutionary new commercial development project next month." Julian continued, lying smoothly to a room full of people he owed money to. "It is a testament to the legacy our mother Evelyn built for us. Generational wealth is not just about money, it is about vision, it is about community, and it is about the unwavering support of the people we love." Julian paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. His expression suddenly softened, shifting from the confident businessman to the vulnerable family man. The spotlight seemed to catch a glint of manufactured moisture in his eyes. He looked directly at the table where I was sitting. "I want to take a special moment tonight to acknowledge my incredible wife Simone," he said, his voice dropping to a softer, more intimate octave. The entire room turned to look at me. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap. Many of you know Simone as a titan in the financial sector, a brilliant, fiercely independent auditor who built her own empire. But brilliance comes with a heavy cost. Simone has been struggling recently. The immense pressure of her career has taken a severe toll on her health and her beautiful mind. A collective murmur of sympathy rippled through the audience. Evelyn pressed a linen napkin to her chest, pretending to look moved. "It breaks my heart to see her fight this battle." Julian continued, his voice cracking with perfect theatrical emotion. "But I want everyone in this room to know that family is forever. I will stand by her side through the darkest moments. I will carry her burdens when she cannot carry them herself. Please raise your glasses. To my beautiful, fragile wife, may she find the peace she so desperately deserves." Hundreds of crystal glasses went up in the air. The crowd applauded warmly, deeply moved by the tragic romance of a wealthy developer standing by his broken bride. Julian raised his own glass from the podium, looking down at me with an expression of absolute terrifying triumph. He had successfully secured his alibi. He had publicly established my mental decline. He had laid the final brick in the narrative that would protect him when my heart miraculously stopped beating. The applause began to fade. Julian smiled, preparing to step down from the podium. He expected me to sit there, lower my head, and cry softly into my napkin. He expected me to be the victim he had engineered me to be. Instead, I pushed my chair back and stood up. I did not stumble. I did not look down. The posture of the broken, heavily medicated woman instantly evaporated. I rolled my shoulders back, standing tall in my black silk gown, the diamond necklace catching the light from the chandeliers. The polite murmurs in the crowd instantly died away. The room fell into a heavy, confused silence. People parted automatically as I stepped away from the table and began walking down the center aisle toward the stage. My strides were long measured and completely grounded in absolute authority. I kept my eyes locked directly on Julian. I watched the confident, triumphant smile slowly slide right off his face. His hands gripped the edges of the wooden podium. He glanced quickly toward Kendrick, a flash of genuine panic finally breaking through his perfect facade. He had no idea what I was doing, but he knew I was not supposed to be standing up. I reached the short flight of stairs leading up to the stage. My high heels clicked sharply against the wood. I walked directly up to the podium, stepping into the blinding glare of the spotlight right next to the man who planned to murder me. Julian moved to block the microphone, his chest heaving slightly. "Simone," he whispered, his voice incredibly low and laced with absolute venom. "What the hell are you doing? Sit down right now. You are having an episode." I did not answer him. I reached out and wrapped my hand around the stem of the microphone. He tried to grip it tighter, trying to physically rip it out of my hand without the audience noticing the struggle. But I am not a fragile woman. I tightened my grip, my manicured nails digging into his knuckles, and I forcefully twisted the microphone out of his grasp. I stepped squarely in front of him, pushing him back an inch with my shoulder, and claimed the podium entirely for myself. "Thank you, Julian, for that incredibly touching introduction," I said. My voice boomed through the ballroom. It was not shaking. It was not weak. It was sharp, crystal clear, and completely commanding. A wave of shocked whispers swept through the front rows. This was not the voice of a woman suffering a severe psychotic break. This was the voice of a forensic accountant commanding a boardroom. Off to the side of the stage near the front tables, Chloe suddenly realized the entire narrative was collapsing. She dropped her champagne glass on the table and practically sprinted toward the side stairs of the stage. Her face was flushed with anger. She marched directly up to the podium, ignoring the hundreds of people watching her. She grabbed my left arm, her acrylic nails digging painfully into my bare skin. "Simone, you are embarrassing the family," Chloe hissed venomously, leaning in close so the microphone would not pick up her words. "You are making a complete fool of yourself in front of half the city. Turn off the microphone and sit down before Kendrick has security drag you out of here." I turned my head and looked down at Chloe's hand gripping my arm. I did not shrink away. I did not apologize. I raised my right hand, placed it flat against her collarbone, and shoved her backward with a sudden, violent burst of physical strength. Chloe gasped loudly, stumbling back 2 steps in her designer heels, her arms flailing wildly to keep her balance. The crowd collectively gasped. Julian lunged forward to grab the microphone again, but I swiftly stepped to the side, maintaining my absolute control of the stage. I looked past the stunned faces of Evelyn and Kendrick in the front row. I looked past the wealthy socialites and the city politicians. I looked all the way to the back of the massive ballroom, directly at the elevated audiovisual booth. Sitting behind the mixing board was a young, highly paid technician I had met with secretly that afternoon. He had my encrypted flash drive plugged directly into the hotel's main projection system. I caught the technician's eye. I gave him a single sharp nod. It was time to burn the empire to the ground. The massive digital screens stretching across the entire back wall of the stage flared blindingly white. The ballroom lights dimmed simultaneously, forcing every single eye in the room to look directly at the towering display. I pressed a button on the small black remote the audiovisual technician had slipped into my hand earlier that afternoon. The first document materialized on the screens in crisp, undeniable high definition. It was a certified bank notice of default. The name at the top was printed in bold black ink, Evelyn. And right below it was the address of the sprawling Buckhead estate we had just dined at on Sunday. The words "Final Notice of Foreclosure" were highlighted in bright, glaring yellow. A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom. The wealthy politicians, socialites, and corporate executives who had just been clapping for Julian were now staring at the screens in absolute shock. I pressed the button again. The screen shifted to the next document. It was the official bankruptcy filing for Kendrick's flagship real estate development firm, showing zero assets and millions of dollars in defaulted liabilities. I raised the microphone to my lips. Generational wealth is indeed a fascinating concept, I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the rising confused murmurs of the crowd. But it appears the only vision this family truly shares is a highly organized Ponzi scheme. The revolutionary new commercial development project my husband just announced does not exist. The firm has absolutely zero capital. In fact, Kendrick is currently facing over $4 million in default loans and multiple civil fraud lawsuits from the very investors standing in this room tonight. Kendrick's face turned ash gray. An older gentleman in the second row, one of Atlanta's most prominent commercial investors, shouted furiously, demanding to know what was going on. Chloe was still standing near the edge of the stage, her mouth hanging open, completely paralyzed by the sudden catastrophic destruction of her social standing. Julian finally snapped out of his frozen shock. He lunged toward me, his handsome face twisted into a mask of pure ugly rage. "Turn it off!" he screamed, reaching desperately for the remote in my hand. I stepped backward easily, avoiding his clumsy grasp, and pressed the final button. The massive screens went completely black. A single audio file icon appeared in the center of the display. The ballroom speakers, calibrated perfectly for live musical performances, suddenly broadcasted a crystal-clear audio recording. Chloe's recorded voice blasted through the room, sharp, shrill, and impatient. "Kendrick is losing his mind, Julian. The bank called Evelyn again this morning. They are threatening to send the sheriff to lock the gates of the estate next week. When is this going to be done?" The crowd went entirely silent. People stopped breathing. Julian froze right in the middle of the stage, his hands hovering in the air, his eyes wide with a terror so profound it looked as if his soul had left his body. Julian's recorded voice answered smoothly from the speakers. "Relax, Chloe. I have the timeline perfectly mapped out. I have the compound ready. She trusts me completely. It will be a tragic, sudden heart attack. Just like Maya. Once she is pronounced dead at the hospital, the power of attorney transfers to me immediately. I will wire the money to Kendrick by the end of the week." Absolute chaos erupted in the Four Seasons ballroom. It was a violent explosion of shouting, screaming, and furious disbelief. Women shrieked in horror. Men began pulling out their phones to record the stage. This was no longer a humiliating financial disclosure about bankrupt frauds. It was a public confession of premeditated murder. Down in the front row, Evelyn stared up at the massive speakers. The pristine high society illusion she had sacrificed everything to maintain was permanently obliterated in front of the exact people she worshipped. She let out a sharp, breathless gasp and clutched her chest with both hands. She collapsed hard onto the carpeted floor. Her heavy pearl necklace snapped against a chair, sending white beads scattering in every direction. For once in her life, she was not acting. The sheer magnitude of the scandal had physically broken her. Kendrick did not bother trying to help his mother. He looked around the screaming crowd, realized the absolute finality of the situation, and bolted. He shoved past a terrified waiter, knocking a silver tray of champagne glasses to the floor with a loud crash, and sprinted toward the massive brass doors at the back of the ballroom. He grabbed the heavy handles and threw his entire body weight against them. The doors did not budge. They were securely chained from the outside by the hotel security staff I had paid off hours ago. I turned my attention back to Julian. He was standing 3 feet away from me. He was trembling violently. The perfectly tailored black tuxedo suddenly looked like a cheap costume on a terrified little boy. "You went into my laptop." Julian stammered, his voice barely a hoarse whisper. His mind was struggling to comprehend how a woman he believed to be heavily medicated and completely broken had orchestrated his total annihilation. I did not just go into your laptop, Julian, I said, making sure the microphone picked up every single cold measured word. I am a forensic accountant. You thought you were hunting a fragile, naive woman. You thought my wealth was simply waiting to be harvested. But while you were playing the devoted husband and feeding me fake concern, I cloned your entire encrypted hard drive. I found the hidden partitions. I found the offshore shell companies you used to hide your stolen money. Julian took a stumbling step backward. I took a step forward, refusing to let him escape my gaze. And most importantly, I found the file on Maya. I said, my voice hardening into absolute steel. I found the life insurance policy you forced her to sign. I know exactly how you isolated her. I know you poisoned her just like you tried to poison my champagne at the restaurant last week. You are insane, Julian breathed, looking around desperately at the screaming crowd trying to find a single friendly face to save him. Nobody will believe this. This is all illegally obtained evidence. It is completely inadmissible in court. You cannot prove anything. I smiled. It was a cold, deeply victorious smile. That might be true if I were the one pressing charges in civil court, I replied smoothly, projecting my voice over the chaos of the ballroom. But I did not bring this evidence to a judge. I brought it to the federal government. I spent yesterday afternoon sitting in a secure conference room with 3 senior agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation and 2 lead auditors from the Internal Revenue Service. I handed them every single wire transfer, every recorded phone call, and the entire paper trail of Kendrick's embezzlement scheme. Julian's knees literally buckled. He dropped heavily onto the wooden stage. The realization washed over him entirely. There was no backup plan. There was no gaslighting his way out of this corner. He had confidently invited the wealthiest, most powerful people in Atlanta to witness his own execution. They have the autopsy reports. Julian continued looking down at the man who had tried to end my life. They have the routing numbers for the offshore accounts. The federal agents are not just investigating you for wire fraud. They are investigating you for the murder of Maya, and they are investigating your entire family for criminal conspiracy. He looked up at me from the floor, his eyes filled with tears of pure, selfish defeat. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some pathetic excuse, but the sound of heavy boots marching into the ballroom cut him off completely. I stood over him, holding the microphone completely untouched by the panic raging around us. I had promised Silas I would burn their fake empire to the ground, and I had delivered the flames. The heavy brass doors at the back of the ballroom were violently pushed open from the outside. The hotel security staff stepped aside, making way for 24 federal agents wearing dark tactical jackets with the bright yellow letters FBI printed across their backs. They flooded into the room, their expressions grim and strictly professional. The high society crowd of Atlanta parted for them, instantly terrified of being caught in the crossfire of a federal raid. Kendrick was the first to be taken down. He was still standing near the chained exit doors, sweating profusely, looking like a trapped animal. 2 agents grabbed him by the arms, slamming him roughly against the wood paneling. Kendrick tried to pull away, shouting that this was a massive misunderstanding, but the agents did not hesitate. They swept his legs, forced him onto the carpet, and snapped cold steel handcuffs forcefully around his wrists. Chloe saw her husband hit the floor and completely lost her mind. The composed, condescending woman who loved to lecture me about my blue-collar roots devolved into a screaming, hysterical mess. She charged at the agents, arresting Kendrick, her designer heels slipping on the polished floor. "Get your hands off him!" Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing wildly through the ballroom. "Do you know who we are? You cannot do this to us. Call my lawyer right now. I demand to speak to whoever is in charge." A female federal agent stepped directly into Chloe's path, holding up a firm hand. Chloe tried to shove past her, fully expecting her wealthy white privilege to act as an invisible shield against the consequences of her actions. It failed spectacularly. The agent swiftly grabbed Chloe's arm, twisting it behind her back with practiced efficiency, and pushed her against a linen-covered cocktail table. Chloe shrieked in genuine pain and shock as the handcuffs clicked tightly over her expensive silk sleeves. She burst into loud, ugly tears, sobbing that she was just a wife, that she did not know anything about any murders, instantly turning on the family she had sworn to protect just to save her own skin. Down at the front of the stage, 4 agents flanked Julian. He did not fight. He did not scream. He simply knelt on the wooden floor, his head bowed, looking absolutely pathetic. An agent hauled him roughly to his feet and pulled his arms behind his back. As the handcuffs ratcheted tightly around his wrists, the lead agent began reciting his Miranda rights. "You have the right to remain silent," the agent said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. Julian slowly lifted his head and looked at me one last time. His eyes were entirely hollow. The charming, wealthy real estate developer was dead. The charismatic predator who had ruined so many lives was gone. He was nothing but a broke, desperate con artist staring at the woman who had finally outsmarted him. I did not look away. I held his gaze with absolute freezing indifference until the agents forcibly turned him around and marched him down the center aisle. I stepped down from the stage and walked past Evelyn. She was still sitting on the carpeted floor where she had collapsed. Her gold gown was wrinkled. The pearls from her broken necklace were scattered around her knees. She was trembling, looking up at the crowd of socialites, politicians, and friends she had spent decades trying to impress. Not a single person stepped forward to help her up. The people she worshipped, the elite circles she had sacrificed Maya's life to remain a part of, were looking at her with absolute disgust. They were whispering, pointing, and turning their backs on her. The bank was going to seize her mansion by the end of the month. The federal government was going to freeze every single dime in the family trust. She was going to be left entirely destitute, publicly disgraced, and utterly alone. Her precious legacy was completely destroyed, and she had to sit there on the floor and watch it burn. I walked past her without saying a single word. I walked out of the ballroom, out of the hotel, and stepped into the cool, fresh night air. I hailed a cab and went home to a house that I owned, completely free from the parasites who had tried to bury me. 6 months later, the legal dust had finally settled. The annulment was processed quickly and quietly. Because I had handed the federal government a perfectly packaged, fully documented case, the trials were brief. Julian was denied bail. Faced with the overwhelming evidence from his own cloned hard drive, the recorded confession, and the offshore routing numbers, his high-priced defense attorney advised him to take a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to federal wire fraud conspiracy to commit murder and the first-degree murder of Maya. He was sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Kendrick received 20 years for massive financial fraud and racketeering. Chloe, despite her desperate attempts to flip on the family, was sentenced to 8 years as an accessory after the fact. Evelyn was left penniless, currently living in a tiny subsidized apartment on the outskirts of the city, completely ostracized by everyone she had ever known. On a crisp Tuesday afternoon, I walked through a quiet, beautiful park in downtown Atlanta. The autumn leaves were turning bright shades of gold and red. I spotted Silas sitting on a wooden bench near a large fountain, tossing breadcrumbs to a flock of pigeons. He wore the same faded wool coat, but the heavy, crushing exhaustion that had weighed down his features for 3 years was gone. He looked peaceful. I sat down on the bench next to him. We watched the water fall in the fountain for a few minutes in comfortable silence. I reached into my designer handbag, pulled out a small, flat wooden frame, and handed it to him. Silas took it gently. Inside the glass frame, perfectly pressed and preserved, was the crumpled $100 bill and the torn white napkin he had slipped into my hand at the steakhouse. "You saved my life, Silas," I said softly. Silas looked down at the frame, his thumb tracing the edge of the glass. He smiled, and for the first time since I met him, the smile reached his eyes. "You gave my daughter her justice, Simone," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You finished the job. Maya can finally rest." We shared a long, silent nod of absolute respect. We were permanently bound by the trauma we had survived and the justice we had fought for. I stood up, touched his shoulder lightly, and walked away, leaving him to sit in the sun. I drove back to the financial district, pulling into the private underground parking garage of my newly expanded firm. Kendrick had always bragged about building a commercial empire. I actually did it. When his flagship building went into federal receivership, to pay off his defrauded investors, I bought the entire property at auction for a fraction of its value, using my own corporate funds. I completely renovated the top 3 floors, moving my forensic accounting firm into the massive sunlit executive suites. I walked into my new corner office and stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the sprawling Atlanta skyline. I am Simone, and I am 35 years old. I survived a predator who wore the mask of a perfect husband. I survived a family that viewed my success as a threat and my life as a commodity. They taught me a valuable lesson. Family is not determined by a marriage license, and it is certainly not a free pass for abuse. Just because someone sits at your dinner table does not mean they have your best interests at heart. People will try to weaponize your independence. They will try to call you crazy when you notice their lies. They will demand that you shrink yourself to make them feel powerful. But I refuse to shrink. I refuse to be a victim. I dug my heels in. I trusted my own brilliant mind, and I fought back with everything I had. Today I am alive. I am incredibly wealthy. I am completely free. And I am writing the rest of my story exactly the way I want it. Have you ever had to trust your gut when everyone around you was trying to make you doubt your own reality? How did you break free from their control? I would love to hear your stories of survival and success in the comments below. If my journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to hear more stories of women standing up, fighting back, and reclaiming their power. Share this video with someone who might need to remember that their independence is a weapon, not a weakness. Thank you for listening, and remember, the best revenge is always your own undeniable success.